Before Solomon's name became a symbol of wisdom, before gold covered the temple he built in Jerusalem, his future depended on a struggle inside his father's house. He would become the king who could answer questions no one else could answer. Nations would come to hear him speak, yet the greatest threat to his kingdom would eventually come through choices that wisdom itself could not excuse. Solomon's reign would rise beneath the favor of God and fall beneath a judgment that reached beyond his lifetime. But it began quietly, with the birth of a son who was not yet the heir. David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and they had a son. David named him Solomon. At once, his life was marked by a declaration unlike any political endorsement a prince could receive. The Lord loved him. God sent word through Nathan the prophet, the same Nathan who would later become decisive in Solomon's rise. The child was also called Jedidiah, a name declaring that he was beloved by the Lord. There was no crown on his head and no public promise of a peaceful succession. There was only a newborn child, the love of God, and a name delivered through a prophet. Years passed. David grew old, advanced in years, and the strength that had carried him through war, flight, and kingship was failing. Even when his attendants covered him with clothing, he could not keep warm. His servants proposed finding a young virgin who could remain near him, care for him, and lie close enough to provide warmth. A search was made throughout Israel, and a young woman named Ahijah was found in Shunem. She was brought to Jerusalem and entered the king's service. She attended David and cared for him, but David had no sexual relations with her. Her presence revealed how much life at the center of Israel had changed. David still held the throne, and his word still carried royal authority, but he now depended upon others for the simplest physical care. The question of who would rule after him could no longer remain distant. Before David publicly settled it, one of his sons moved to settle it for him. Adonijah was the son of David and Haggith. He had been born after Absalom, the son whose beauty, ambition, and rebellion had already brought devastation into David's house. Adonijah was also striking in appearance, and as David weakened, Adonijah elevated himself. "I will be king," he declared. He did more than announce an ambition. He created the visible image of royalty around himself. He obtained chariots and horsemen, with 50 men running ahead of him. This was a campaign presented as if the decision had already been made. Adonijah acted publicly, like a man whose reign had begun before David's had ended. David had never confronted him by asking, "Why have you done this?" The king's failure to challenge his son now had consequences beyond their household. Adonijah had learned that he could act without receiving an answer from his father. With the throne approaching a transfer, that freedom became dangerous. He also secured powerful allies. Joab joined him. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, had commanded David's army and had survived the violent turns of David's reign. His support gave Adonijah a connection to military power and to a man with deep experience inside the kingdom. Abiathar the priest also supported Adonijah. With a veteran commander and a prominent priest beside him, Adonijah's claim no longer looked like the private wish of an impatient prince. It had the beginnings of a governing coalition. But David's servants did not move as one body. Zadok the priest did not join Adonijah. Neither did Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, nor Nathan the prophet. Shimei, Ray, and David's mighty men also remained apart from him. Most important of all, Solomon was not included. Adonijah gathered his supporters near En-Rogel, beside the stone of Zoheleth. There he sacrificed sheep, cattle, and fattened animals. He invited his brothers, the other sons of David, along with the royal officials from Judah. The gathering looked like a celebration, but its guest list exposed its political purpose. Nathan was not invited. Benaiah was not invited. David's mighty men were not invited. Solomon was not invited. Adonijah had brought together those whose presence could strengthen his claim and excluded those most closely connected to another outcome. While David remained in his chamber, Adonijah was assembling a royal court around himself. Nathan recognized what was happening. He went to Bathsheba. "Have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king, and David our Lord does not know it?" That was the immediate danger. Adonijah was acting as king without David's knowledge, and his success would place Bathsheba and Solomon directly in his path. Nathan told her that his counsel could save both her life and Solomon's. She was to go to David and remind him of the oath he had made to her. Solomon would reign after him, and Solomon would sit upon his throne. Then she was to ask why Adonijah had become king. While she was still speaking, Nathan would enter and confirm her words. The plan depended on facts David could verify. Bathsheba would appeal to his promise. Nathan would report what Adonijah had done. The king, who had not stopped Adonijah earlier, would now be forced to decide whether his silence would determine Israel's future. Bathsheba entered David's chamber. Abishag was there, attending the old king. Bathsheba bowed low before him. David asked what she wanted. "My lord," she said, "you swore to your servant by the Lord your God, saying, 'Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne.'" Then she placed the present reality beside that oath. "Now, behold, Adonijah is king, and you, my lord the king, do not know it." She told David about the sacrifices. Adonijah had slaughtered cattle, fattened animals, and sheep in abundance. He had invited the king's sons, Abiathar the priest, and Joab the commander of the army. Solomon, however, had not been invited. This was no small family gathering and no harmless feast. Men connected to the throne, the priesthood, and the army were already treating Adonijah's claim as something to celebrate. The succession was becoming public, while David remained uninformed. Bathsheba then explained why the king's answer could not wait. All Israel was looking to David to identify who would sit on his throne after him. If David died without acting, she and Solomon would be counted as offenders. Adonijah's kingship would turn Solomon from a possible successor into a rival, and Bathsheba into the mother of that rival. While she was still speaking, Nathan arrived. The king was informed that Nathan the prophet was outside. Nathan entered, bowed with his face to the ground, and addressed David. "My lord the king, have you said, 'Adonijah shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne'?" Nathan was not asking because he believed David had made such an announcement. He was placing Adonijah's actions before the only man whose authorization could make sense of them. He reported that Adonijah had gone down that day and sacrificed cattle, fattened animals, and sheep in abundance. He had invited all the king's sons, the army commanders, and Abiathar the priest. They were eating and drinking in Adonijah's presence, declaring, "Long live King Adonijah." The title was already being spoken. Then Nathan named those who had been left outside: himself, Zadok the priest, Benaiah, and Solomon. The exclusions matched Bathsheba's warning. Adonijah's celebration had divided David's servants before David had declared a successor. "Has this thing been done by my lord the king?" Nathan asked. "And you have not told your servants who should sit on the throne of my lord the king after him?" David now knew what had happened. Two witnesses had brought him the same crisis from different positions. Bathsheba had reminded him of his oath and the danger to her son. Nathan had described a rival coronation taking shape without royal authorization. David ordered that Bathsheba be called back into his presence. She returned and stood before him. The old king then swore by the living God, who had delivered him from every distress. He confirmed that the oath he had made by the Lord would stand. Solomon, Bathsheba's son, would reign after him. Solomon would sit on David's throne. And David added the words that changed the pace of everything happening in Jerusalem: "I will do this day." Bathsheba bowed with her face to the ground. She paid homage to the king and said, "May my lord King David live forever." David immediately called for Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. The three men Adonijah had excluded were now summoned to carry out the king's command. They entered David's presence, and he gave them precise instructions. They were to take the royal servants with them, place Solomon on David's own mule, and lead him down to Gihon. There, Zadok and Nathan were to anoint him king over Israel. A trumpet was to be blown, and the people were to proclaim, "Long live King Solomon." Then they were to bring Solomon back up. He would enter and sit upon David's throne. David was not merely naming a future heir. Solomon was to become king immediately. "He shall be king in my place," David said, "and I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and over Judah." Benaiah answered the command with amen. He called upon the Lord, the God of David, to confirm it. As God had been with David, Benaiah said, "So may he be with Solomon, and make Solomon's throne greater than the throne of his father." There was no time for a prolonged debate among the king's sons, or for negotiation with Adonijah's supporters. David had spoken, and the men still loyal to his command moved at once. Zadok, Nathan, and Benaiah went down with David's guards. They placed Solomon on the king's mule and escorted him to Gihon. The contrast between the two claims was now visible. Adonijah had provided his own chariots, his own runners, his own sacrifices, and his own feast. Solomon rode the mule belonging to David. Adonijah had gathered supporters and accepted the cry of kingship. Solomon arrived under a direct command from the reigning king. At Gihon, Zadok took a horn of oil from the sacred tent. In the presence of Nathan, Benaiah, the royal guards, and the gathered people, he anointed Solomon. The trumpet sounded, "Long live King Solomon." The proclamation was no longer being made at a private feast by guests chosen to support a claimant. It rang out around the son whom David had publicly appointed and the priest had anointed. The people followed Solomon back toward Jerusalem. They played pipes and rejoiced with such force that the ground seemed to split beneath the sound. What had begun in David's quiet chamber had become a public procession. The old king's decision was moving uphill toward his throne, carried by music, shouting, and an entire crowd. But beyond that celebration, another feast was still in progress. Adonijah sat among the sons of David, the royal officials, Joab and Abiathar. They had eaten and drunk while calling him king. Now the sound of Solomon's procession was traveling toward them, and they did not yet know what it meant. Joab heard the trumpet. As Adonijah and his guests finished eating, the sound reached them from the city. Joab, trained to recognize the signals surrounding armies and kings, asked why Jerusalem was making such an uproar. Before anyone at the feast could answer, Jonathan arrived. He was the son of Abiathar, the priest, one of Adonijah's most important supporters. Adonijah welcomed him with confidence. "Come in, for you are a worthy man and bring good news." Jonathan's answer began with a single word: "No." King David had made Solomon king. David had sent Zadok, Nathan, Benaiah, and the royal guards with Solomon. They had placed him on the king's mule. Zadok and Nathan had anointed him at Gihon. The trumpet had been blown, and the people had followed Solomon back with such rejoicing that the whole city was in an uproar. "That is the noise you have heard," Jonathan told them. But the news went further. Solomon had already taken his seat on the royal throne. David's servants had entered the old king's chamber to bless him. They had asked God to make Solomon's name more renowned than David's, and Solomon's throne greater than his father's throne. David had bowed in worship on his bed and blessed the Lord, the God of Israel, for allowing him to see one of his sons sitting on his throne that very day. The gathering beside Enrogel had been overtaken in a matter of hours. David had acted. Solomon had been anointed by the priest and prophet Adonijah had excluded. The royal servants had carried out David's orders. The people had accepted Solomon with celebration, and Solomon now occupied the throne Adonijah had claimed. The guests at Adonijah's feast trembled. They rose from their places and scattered, each going his own way. The coalition dissolved as soon as Solomon's kingship became undeniable. The men who had eaten in Adonijah's presence and called him king did not remain with him when the consequences arrived. Adonijah was now afraid of Solomon. He left the feast, went to the altar, and took hold of its horns. From there, he made his appeal for protection. Word reached Solomon that Adonijah feared him and had grasped the horns of the altar. Adonijah was asking King Solomon to swear that he would not put his servant to death with the sword. Only hours earlier, Adonijah had accepted the title of king. Now he referred to himself as Solomon's servant. Solomon did not swear the unconditional oath Adonijah requested. He offered mercy with a clear boundary. If he proves to be a worthy man, not one of his hairs shall fall to the ground. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. Solomon then sent men to bring Adonijah down from the altar. Adonijah came before the newly enthroned king and bowed to him. "Go to your house," Solomon said. For the moment, the succession crisis ended without Adonijah's blood being shed. Solomon allowed him to leave, but the condition attached to that mercy placed Adonijah's future in his own conduct. He had been spared as a defeated rival, not restored as an equal claimant. David's strength continued to fail, and the time of his death drew near. He called Solomon and gave him a final charge. "I am about to go the way of all the earth," David said. "Be strong and show yourself a man." Strength, as David now defined it for his son, began with obedience. Solomon was to keep the charge of the Lord his God, walk in his ways, and observe his statutes, commandments, rules, and testimonies written in the law of Moses. David connected Solomon's success as king to that faithfulness. Obedience was to guide what he did and wherever he turned. The future of David's royal line carried the same condition. The Lord had promised that if David's descendants watched their way and walked faithfully before him with all their heart and soul, David would not lack a man on Israel's throne. Solomon was receiving an established kingdom, but not an unconditional guarantee that every choice made within it would prosper. The throne came with a covenant responsibility. The son once named beloved by the Lord would have to remain loyal to the God who had placed him there. David then turned to unresolved dangers within the kingdom. Solomon knew what Joab had done. Joab had killed Abner, the son of Ner, and Amasa, the son of Jether. Both men had commanded armies of Israel. Joab had shed their blood in a time of peace, placing the violence of war upon the belt around his waist and the sandals on his feet. David told Solomon to act according to his wisdom. Joab was now an old man, but David instructed his son not to let Joab's grey head go down to the grave in peace. This was the commander who had supported Adonijah's attempt to take the throne. His earlier bloodshed and his recent political choice now stood together before the new king. David did not prescribe the exact occasions Solomon should use. He placed the responsibility in Solomon's hands and told him to act wisely. David also named a debt of loyalty that Solomon was to honor. He was to show steadfast kindness to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead and give them a place among those who ate at the royal table. Barzillai had come to David's aid when David fled from Absalom. The succession would therefore carry forward not only judgment against dangerous men, but gratitude toward those who had stood by David in danger. Then David spoke of Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite from Bahurim. Shimei had cursed David with a grievous curse when David traveled toward Mahanaim. Later, he came down to meet David at the Jordan. On that occasion, David had sworn by the Lord that he would not put Shimei to death with the sword. David's oath had spared Shimei from David's hand, but David now warned Solomon not to treat him as innocent. Solomon was a wise man and would know what to do. David instructed him to bring Shimei's grey head down to the grave with blood. These instructions showed Solomon where the reign still carried unfinished obligations. Joab's violence required judgment. Barzillai's loyalty required kindness. Shimei remained under scrutiny, despite the oath that had preserved his life. Solomon would have to distinguish among them and act as king. David then died and was buried in the city that bore his name. He had reigned over Israel for 40 years, 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. Yet one of the men released after the failed succession soon returned to the center of royal attention. Adonijah went to Bathsheba. When she saw him, she asked, "Do you come peacefully?" "Peacefully," he answered. He told her that he had something to say, and she permitted him to speak. Adonijah began by describing the lost succession from his own point of view. "You know that the kingdom was mine, and that all Israel expected me to reign." That claim ignored the fact that David had never publicly installed him. Still, Adonijah had gathered the king's sons, royal officials Joab and Abiathar, and for the length of one feast, he had been addressed as king. Then he acknowledged the decision that had defeated him. "The kingdom has turned about and become my brother's, for it was his from the Lord." Adonijah followed that acknowledgement with a request. "Now I have one petition to make of you. Do not refuse me." Bathsheba asked him to state it. He wanted her to speak to King Solomon on his behalf, because Solomon would not refuse her. She was to ask the king to give Abishag the Shunammite to Adonijah as his wife. Abishag had attended David in his final weakness. She had remained in his chamber, cared for him, and provided warmth, although David had not had sexual relations with her. Adonijah was now asking to marry a young woman publicly associated with the household of the dead king. Bathsheba agreed to carry the request. She went to Solomon. When she entered, Solomon rose to meet her and bowed before her. Then he sat on his throne and ordered another seat to be placed for the king's mother. Bathsheba sat at his right hand. "I have one small request to make of you," she said. "Do not refuse me." Solomon told his mother to ask. He would not refuse her. "Let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah your brother as his wife." Solomon immediately treated the request as far more than a proposed marriage. "And why do you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah?" he replied. "Ask for him the kingdom also, for he is my older brother." Then Solomon joined Adonijah's name to those of the two powerful men who had backed his claim, Abiathar the priest and Joab the son of Zeruiah. Adonijah had already declared that the kingdom belonged to Solomon from the Lord. He had already received conditional mercy after taking hold of the altar. Now he had sought a marital connection to David's household through the king's mother. Solomon judged the request as a renewed claim upon the kingdom. He swore by the Lord that Adonijah had spoken these words against his own life. "As the Lord lives," Solomon declared, "who has established me and placed me on the throne of David my father, and who has made me a house as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death today." Solomon gave the order to Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada. Benaiah struck Adonijah down, and Adonijah died. The mercy offered at the altar had depended on Adonijah proving himself worthy. His approach through Bathsheba brought that period of mercy to an abrupt end. The brother who had tried to become king before David's death was now removed permanently from the succession. Solomon then turned to Abiathar. The priest had stood with Adonijah at Enrogel, but Solomon did not order his immediate execution. Instead, he commanded Abiathar to leave Jerusalem and return to his own fields at Anathoth. "You deserve death," Solomon told him. Then he named the service that spared Abiathar's life. Abiathar had carried the ark of the Lord God before David, and he had shared in all the afflictions David endured. His history with Solomon's father did not preserve his office, but it preserved him from death that day. Solomon expelled Abiathar from serving as priest to the Lord. His removal fulfilled the word the Lord had spoken at Shiloh concerning the house of Eli. Adonijah was dead. Abiathar had been sent away from Jerusalem and stripped of priestly authority. And when Solomon had named the men behind his brother's claim, the third name had been Joab. News of Solomon's judgments reached Joab. He had supported Adonijah, although he had not supported Absalom when Absalom rebelled against David. Adonijah's execution and Abiathar's removal showed that Solomon was acting against the coalition that had tried to place another son on David's throne. Joab fled to the tent of the Lord and took hold of the horns of the altar. The commander who had spent years carrying a sword now made his stand at the sacred place. Adonijah had once taken hold of those same horns and asked Solomon to spare his life. Solomon had granted him conditional mercy. Joab also placed himself beside the altar, but the judgment against him involved more than his support for Adonijah. Solomon was told that Joab had fled to the tent of the Lord and was standing beside the altar. The king sent Benaiah with a direct command: "Go, strike him down." Benaiah entered the tent and delivered Solomon's order to Joab. "Thus says the king, come out." Joab refused. "No," he said, "I will die here." Joab had chosen the place where he would face Solomon's sentence. Benaiah did not carry out the execution immediately. He returned to the king and reported exactly what Joab had said. Solomon answered, "Do as he has said. Strike him down and bury him." Then the king explained why Joab's presence at the altar would not preserve him. Joab's death would remove from David and David's household the guilt of innocent blood that Joab had shed. Solomon named the two men whose deaths stood behind that judgment. The first was Abner, the son of Ner, commander of the army of Israel. The second was Amasa, the son of Jether, commander of the army of Judah. Joab had attacked and killed both of them with the sword. Solomon described them as more righteous and better than Joab, and David had not known that Joab would kill them. Joab's service to David had not given him authority to shed their blood. His victories and his position as commander had not erased those deaths. David had carried the unresolved burden into his final days and had charged Solomon to act with wisdom. Now Solomon declared that the Lord would return Joab's bloodshed upon his own head. The consequences would rest upon Joab and his descendants, while David, his descendants, his household, and his throne would have peace from the Lord. Benaiah went back to the tent. He struck Joab down and killed him. Joab was then buried at his own house in the wilderness. The man who had commanded David's army and supported Adonijah's claim was gone. His decision to remain at the altar determined the location of his death, but it did not change the king's sentence. Solomon then placed Benaiah over the army in Joab's position. Benaiah had remained with David when Adonijah gathered his supporters. He had helped escort Solomon to Gihon, stood beside him at the anointing, and carried out the judgments against Adonijah and Joab. He now received command of the military force Joab had once led. Solomon also appointed Zadok to Abiathar's position as priest. Zadok had rejected Adonijah's claim, joined Nathan and Benaiah in carrying out David's order, and anointed Solomon at Gihon. With Joab dead and Abiathar removed, their offices passed to men who had stood with Solomon during the succession. One figure named in David's final charge remained. Solomon summoned Shimei and ordered him to build a house in Jerusalem and live there. The king allowed him to remain alive, but he placed a precise boundary around him. "Do not go out from there to any place whatever," Solomon said. The consequence was stated just as clearly. On the day Shimei left Jerusalem and crossed the brook Kidron, he could know with certainty that he would die. His blood would be upon his own head. Shimei accepted the command. "What you say is good," he told Solomon. "As my lord the king has said, so will your servant do." Shimei then lived in Jerusalem for many days. Solomon's treatment of Shimei differed from the immediate sentence imposed on Joab. David had sworn that he would not put Shimei to death with the sword, but he had warned Solomon not to consider him innocent. Solomon answered that tension with a binding restriction. Shimei could continue living under the king's protection as long as he remained within Jerusalem. If he crossed the stated boundary, the violation itself would activate the announced penalty. For 3 years, Shimei remained under that condition. At the end of those 3 years, 2 of his servants fled. They went to Achish, the son of Maacah, king of Gath. Shimei was told, "Behold, your servants are in Gath." The situation now placed something belonging to Shimei beyond the boundary Solomon had set. The king's command had not included an exception for recovering servants, and Shimei had sworn by the Lord to obey it. Shimei rose and saddled his donkey. He left Jerusalem and traveled to Gath to find his servants. He went to Achish, recovered them, and brought them back from Gath. He succeeded in the purpose of his journey, but the journey itself violated his oath. He had crossed out of the place Solomon had commanded him to remain, traveled into another king's territory, and returned to Jerusalem with the 2 servants. Solomon was informed that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and had come back. The king summoned him. "Did I not make you swear by the Lord," Solomon asked, "and solemnly warn you, saying, 'Know for certain that on the day you go out and travel anywhere, you shall die'?" Solomon then reminded Shimei of his own answer. Shimei had called the command good and promised to obey. "Why then have you not kept your oath to the Lord and the command with which I commanded you?" Shimei's trip was not being judged according to a condition revealed after his return. Solomon had stated the boundary, the penalty, and the certainty of the penalty at the beginning. Shimei had accepted all 3. His departure for Gath now stood as a breach of his sworn word. Solomon then returned to the matter David had placed before him. "You know in your own heart all the evil that you did to David my father." Shimei had cursed David during David's flight toward Mahanaim. He had later met David at the Jordan, where David swore not to kill him with the sword. That oath had spared Shimei at the time, but his conduct remained known to him and to the royal house. Solomon declared that the Lord would return Shimei's evil upon his own head, but King Solomon would be blessed, and David's throne would be established before the Lord. Then Solomon gave the order to Benaiah. Benaiah went out, struck Shimei down, and Shimei died. The restrictions David had left for Solomon were now resolved. Joab had been judged for the blood of Abner and Amasa. The sons of Barzillai remained designated for royal kindness. Shimei had lived under a sworn boundary and died after breaking it. The priesthood and army had been placed under Zadok and Benaiah, men who had carried out David's decision at the moment of succession. The kingdom was established in Solomon's hand. He had survived the struggle for David's throne, dismantled the coalition behind Adonijah, and completed the judgments his father had entrusted to him. He was no longer a prince whose future depended on action inside a dying king's chamber. He was the recognized ruler of Israel. Now the greater measure of his reign could begin. Power had been secured. Solomon would have to decide how to use it. Solomon grew strong in his kingship. The Lord his God was with him and made him exceedingly great. Solomon also formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He married Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David. She remained there while Solomon worked toward the completion of 3 major projects: the house of the Lord, his own royal house, and the wall around Jerusalem. At that time the people were sacrificing at high places because a house for the name of the Lord had not yet been built. Solomon loved the Lord and walked according to the statutes of David his father, except that he also sacrificed and burned incense at those high places. The throne had been secured, but the central place of worship Solomon would one day build did not yet exist. The Ark of the Covenant was in Jerusalem, inside the tent David had prepared for it. The tabernacle Moses had made in the wilderness stood at Gibeon, along with the bronze altar made by Bezalel, the son of Uri and grandson of Hur. Solomon called together Israel's leaders, commanders of thousands and hundreds, judges, chiefs, and heads of ancestral households. He went with the assembly to the high place at Gibeon to seek the Lord. Gibeon was regarded as the great high place. Solomon approached the bronze altar before the tabernacle and offered 1,000 burnt offerings upon it. That night, while Solomon was at Gibeon, God appeared to him in a dream. "Ask what I shall give you." The offer placed no named object before Solomon. The king, who had just inherited David's authority, was invited to say what he most wanted God to provide. Solomon began by speaking about what God had already done. "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father," he said, "because he walked before you in faithfulness, righteousness, and uprightness of heart toward you." God's steadfast love to David had continued beyond David's death. He had given David a son to sit upon his throne. Solomon understood his kingship as part of that continuing gift. "And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father." Then Solomon described his own need. He called himself a little child who did not know how to go out or come in. He was speaking as the ruler of a people whose life, judgment, and direction had been placed in his hands. He stood in the midst of the people God had chosen, a people so great and numerous that Solomon described them as beyond counting. The scale of that responsibility determined his request. "Give your servant, therefore, an understanding heart to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil." He did not ask merely to possess information. He asked for the ability to hear, judge, and distinguish rightly while governing. His reason was direct. "Who is able to govern this great people of yours?" Solomon asked for wisdom and knowledge so that he could go out and come in before the people. He had received David's throne, but he did not present the throne itself as proof that he already possessed everything required to rule well. Authority gave him the right to decide. It did not automatically give him the discernment to make each decision justly. The request pleased God. Because Solomon had asked for an understanding mind to govern and administer justice, God answered beyond the limits of the request. Solomon had not asked for long life. He had not asked for the death of his enemies. He had not asked for possessions, wealth, or personal honor. He had asked for wisdom and knowledge to judge the people over whom God had made him king. God promised to give Solomon a wise and discerning mind, unlike any before him and unlike any that would come after him. Wisdom and knowledge would be his. Then God added the things Solomon had not requested. Riches, possessions, and honor would also be given to him. Among the kings of his time, none would compare with him throughout his days. A further promise remained conditional. If Solomon walked in God's ways and kept his statutes and commandments as David had walked, God would lengthen his days. The answer joined wisdom, royal greatness, and obedience without treating them as the same thing. Solomon would receive extraordinary discernment. He would receive wealth and honor with it. But the course of his life would still be shaped by whether he walked in the ways God had commanded. Solomon awoke and understood that he had been dreaming. He left the high place at Gibeon and returned to Jerusalem. There he stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. He offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and then made a feast for all his servants. The king had asked for wisdom to govern. Soon, a dispute came before him in which ordinary testimony could not settle the truth. Two women who were prostitutes entered and stood before the king. One of them began to speak. "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house." She told Solomon that she had given birth while the other woman was in the house. On the third day after her child was born, the other woman also gave birth. According to her testimony, they were alone together. No outsider was in the house with them. Then, she said, the other woman's son died during the night because the woman had lain on him. The first woman accused her of getting up at midnight while she slept, taking the living child from beside her and placing him at her own breast. The dead child was then placed beside the sleeping mother. "When I rose in the morning to nurse my child," she told Solomon, "behold, he was dead. But when she examined him carefully in the morning, she realized that the dead child beside her was not the son she had delivered. The other woman immediately denied it. 'No, the living child is my son, and the dead child is your son.' The first woman answered, 'No, the dead child is your son, and the living child is my son.' The two women argued before Solomon. Each woman claimed the living infant. Each woman assigned the dead infant to the other. The first woman had given a detailed description of the night, but she had also told the king that the two of them had been alone inside the house. Their competing claims therefore presented Solomon with words against words. There was one living child before the king, and two women identifying themselves as his mother. Solomon restated the dispute clearly. One says, "This is my son who is alive and your son is dead." The other says, "No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one." Then the king gave an unexpected command. "Bring me a sword." A sword was brought and placed before him. Solomon said, "Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other." The dispute changed immediately. Until that moment, both women had fought to possess the same child. Solomon's command confronted them with the proposed death of the child they claimed. The woman whose son was alive was overcome with compassion for him. She turned to the king and surrendered her claim rather than see the child killed. "Oh, my lord, give her the living child and by no means put him to death." The other woman gave a different answer. "He shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide him." Solomon now delivered his judgment. "Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother." The woman who pleaded for the child's life received him. By surrendering possession of her son, she had revealed the bond that words alone had not established. The other woman's willingness to accept the child's death exposed the difference between their claims. Solomon had not divided the infant. He had divided the two women by requiring a response to the threatened loss of the child. One accepted losing her case so that the boy could live. Solomon recognized her as the mother and preserved both her son and her right to him. News of the judgment spread throughout Israel. The people heard how the king had decided the case, and they stood in awe of him. They recognized that the wisdom of God was in Solomon to administer justice. The gift received at Gibeon had become visible in public judgment. Solomon had listened to a dispute with no supporting witness, exposed what separated two nearly identical claims, protected the innocent life placed before him, and returned the child to his mother. But Solomon had asked for wisdom because Israel was too great for him to govern alone. One difficult case could reveal the quality of his discernment. Ruling the whole kingdom would require that discernment to shape officials, districts, provisions, security, and every daily demand of royal government. Solomon answered that demand by building an administration that extended from his court into every region under his rule. He was king over all Israel. Beneath him stood officials responsible for worship, military command, royal correspondence, public memory, household management, labor, and the continuous provision of the court. Azariah, the son of Zadok, served as priest. Elihoreph and Ahijah, the sons of Shisha, served as secretaries. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was the recorder. Benaiah now commanded the army in Joab's place, while Zadok held the priestly position from which Abiathar had been removed. Azariah, the son of Nathan, supervised the district officers. Zabud, another son of Nathan, was a priest and the king's friend. Ahishar managed the royal household. Adoniram, the son of Abda, was placed over the forced labor. These offices connected Solomon's decisions to the daily operation of the kingdom. A judgment delivered from the throne could reveal wisdom, but the king also required people who could communicate orders, command forces, oversee worship, manage his household, and organize the labor demanded by royal projects. Provision presented a challenge of its own. Solomon's court, servants, and military establishment consumed resources every day. The king appointed 12 district officers over Israel, and each officer was responsible for supplying provisions for Solomon and his household during 1 month of the year. Their districts were defined by towns, regions, and established territorial boundaries. Ben-Hur was assigned the hill country of Ephraim. Ben-Decker governed Makaz, Shalbim, Beth-Shemesh, and Elon-Beth-Hanan. Ben-Hesed held Aruboth, including Soko and all the land of Hepher. Ben-Abinadab governed the heights of Dor. His connection to Solomon's house was also personal. He had married Taphath, one of Solomon's daughters. Baana, the son of Ahilud, was responsible for Taanach and Megiddo, and for the region around Beth-Shean beside Zarethan, below Jezreel. His district extended from Beth-Shean to Abel-Meholah and beyond Jokmeam. Ben-Geber governed Ramoth-Gilead. His territory included the villages of Jair, the son of Manasseh, in Gilead, and the region of Argob in Bashan. That region contained 60 great cities with walls and bronze bars. Ahinadab, the son of Iddo, was assigned Mahanaim. Ahimaaz governed Naphtali. He had married Basemath, another daughter of Solomon. Baana, the son of Hushai, governed Asher and Baaloth. Jehoshaphat, the son of Paruah, governed Issachar. Shimei, the son of Elah, governed Benjamin. Geber, the son of Uri, held the land of Gilead, including the former territories of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. He was the only officer assigned to that land. The 12 officers did not merely hold regional titles. Every month, responsibility moved to one of them. The officer for that month supplied King Solomon and all who came to his table. Each brought the required provisions to the designated place, and the king's household lacked nothing assigned to their care. The daily quantities reveal the scale of what these districts supported. Solomon's provision for a single day included 30 cors of fine flour and 60 cors of meal. It included 10 fattened cattle, 20 cattle from the pasture, and 100 sheep. Deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened birds were supplied in addition. The same administrative network supported Solomon's horses. The officers brought barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds, each delivering it to the required location according to his assigned duty. This was government expressed through movement: grain from the districts, livestock for the royal table, fodder for the horses, and one regional officer after another assuming responsibility for a month. Solomon's household could function at such size because the demand was distributed across the year and attached to named officials. The abundance reached beyond the court. Judah and Israel were described as numerous as the sand beside the sea. They ate, drank, and rejoiced. Solomon's dominion also extended beyond Israel's central territory. He ruled over the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines and down to the border of Egypt. Those kingdoms brought tribute and served Solomon throughout his life. His authority reached from Tifsah to Gaza, over the kings west of the Euphrates. Peace surrounded him on every side. Within Judah and Israel, people lived in safety from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. Each man could sit beneath his own vine and fig tree during Solomon's days. The peace of the kingdom rested beside an expanding military establishment. Solomon accumulated chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, stationing them in chariot cities and with himself in Jerusalem. His chariot forces were supported by thousands of stalls for horses. The chariot cities connected royal power to locations beyond Jerusalem, while the mounted force near the king gave Solomon a concentration of military strength at the capital. The same officers who provisioned the court also supplied the grain and straw that sustained those animals. Solomon gathered chariots and horses from Egypt and Kue. His merchants purchased them from Kue at the established price. A chariot imported from Egypt cost 600 shekels of silver, while a horse cost 150. Through Solomon's merchants, chariots and horses were also supplied to the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Aram. Jerusalem became a center not only of royal command, but of accumulated wealth. Solomon made silver and gold as common in Jerusalem as stones. He made cedar as abundant as the sycamore trees of the lowland. The wealth God had promised at Gibeon was becoming visible. It appeared in precious metal, imported horses, royal chariots, fortified centers, daily provisions, and the reach of merchants beyond Israel. Yet Solomon's fame did not rest on wealth alone. God gave him wisdom and exceedingly great understanding. The breadth of his mind was compared to the sand along the seashore. His wisdom surpassed the wisdom associated with the peoples of the East and the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, Heman, Calcol, and Dada, the sons of Mahol. His reputation spread among the surrounding nations. Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs and composed 1,005 songs. His knowledge reached into the living world around him. He spoke about trees, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop growing from a wall. He spoke about animals, birds, creeping things, and fish. The range was striking. The same mind that had distinguished between two women's claims could move through sayings, songs, plants, land animals, creatures that moved close to the ground, birds of the air, and fish of the waters. His wisdom was not confined to one type of question or one place of judgment. People came from every nation to hear Solomon's wisdom. They were sent by kings who had heard of it. The movement now flowed toward Jerusalem in two forms. Tribute, wealth, horses, and trade goods entered the kingdom because of Solomon's power. Visitors also came because of what he knew. His administration allowed those streams to continue. District officers supplied his household. Secretaries, commanders, priests, household managers, and labor supervisors held defined responsibilities. Merchants carried silver across borders for horses and chariots. Regional governors connected distant towns and fortified territories to the royal center. Solomon's request at Gibeon had begun with a confession that the people were too numerous for him to govern by himself. His answer was not to place every decision in the hands of one man. He remained king and judge, but officials carried authority into military, priestly, regional, and household work. That system also revealed the cost of royal greatness. A court receiving such daily quantities required continuous provision. Chariots required horses, stalls, barley, and straw. Construction and royal service required supervised labor. International trade required merchants and large payments of silver. For the moment, those demands existed within peace and abundance. The people ate, drank, and rejoiced. The districts completed their appointed months. The surrounding kingdoms brought tribute. Solomon's horses stood in their cities, and travelers carried his reputation far beyond Israel. He had become the kind of ruler other kings wanted to hear. His words could be preserved in proverbs and songs. His judgments could cause Israel to stand in awe. His officers could supply a royal household of extraordinary size without interrupting the daily operation of the kingdom. And the geographic reach of his administration mattered. Solomon's officers were not concentrated only in Jerusalem. Their responsibilities extended across hill country, plains, fortified cities, former royal territories east of the Jordan, and lands reaching toward the outer limits of his dominion. Each district brought part of Israel's resources into service of the throne. Two of those officers were joined to Solomon through marriage to his daughters. Others were sons of men already associated with royal service. The kingdom was becoming a network of authority, obligation, and household ties centered on Solomon. At its center stood a king whose public identity was becoming inseparable from wisdom. The judgment between the two women had shown discernment in a crisis. The administration showed wisdom applied to scale. Solomon did not personally carry grain from Ephraim, gather cattle from the pasture, provide straw for horses, govern every fortified city, or conduct every exchange with foreign lands. Named officials received those responsibilities and answered to the royal house. The prosperity of Judah and Israel accompanied that order. Safety under vine and fig tree gave a physical measure of peace. The phrase did not describe the royal court, but ordinary households across the land, from Dan to Beersheba. Solomon's dominion had not only increased what came to the king, it had also created conditions in which the people lived securely. Outside Israel, the effect was service and tribute. The kingdoms under Solomon's dominion acknowledged his power throughout his life. The border of that authority ran from the Euphrates toward Philistine territory and Egypt. Within it, Solomon held command over the kings west of the river. The military resources surrounding that dominion were substantial, but Solomon's days were characterized by peace on every side. Chariots and horsemen accumulated, while tribute continued to arrive. The army remained under Benaiah, the man whose loyalty had helped secure the succession. Zadok held priestly authority, linking Solomon's government to worship. Yet the kingdom still possessed two sacred centers with different roles. The ark stood in Jerusalem under the tent David had prepared. The tabernacle and bronze altar had stood at Gibeon when Solomon offered his 1,000 sacrifices and received wisdom. A permanent house for the name of the Lord had still not been completed. Solomon now possessed what such a work would demand. His kingdom was secure, his authority extended across Israel. Regional officials could gather provisions and organize resources. Adoniram supervised forced labor. Merchants moved between kingdoms. Cedar had become abundant in Jerusalem, and wealth entered the capital through tribute and trade. The king, who knew how to organize a nation, was approaching the work that would define the visible center of his reign. Wisdom had given order to the kingdom. Peace had opened space for construction. International power had created access to foreign material and expertise. Jerusalem had Solomon's throne. It had the Ark of the Covenant. It had the tent David had prepared. But the house intended for the name of the Lord remained unbuilt, waiting for Solomon to turn the full strength of his ordered kingdom toward it. That work began through a relationship David had formed beyond Israel's borders. When Hiram, king of Tyre, heard that Solomon had been anointed in David's place, he sent servants to the new king. Hiram had always loved David, and Solomon now used that friendship to open negotiations for the temple. Solomon sent Hiram a message explaining why David had never built the house. David had faced war on every side. His enemies had surrounded him until the Lord placed them beneath his feet. Because David's reign had been occupied by warfare, he had not been able to build a house for the name of the Lord his God. Solomon's situation was different. But now, "The Lord my God has given me rest on every side," he told Hiram. "There is neither adversary nor misfortune." The peace Solomon governed was not simply an end in itself. It created the opportunity to complete work that years of conflict had delayed. Solomon intended to build a house for the name of the Lord. God had told David that his son, the one placed upon his throne, would build that house. Solomon now occupied the throne and understood the commission as his. His request to Hiram was direct. Hiram was to order cedar trees cut for Solomon from Lebanon. Solomon's servants would work alongside Hiram's servants, and Solomon would pay the wages Hiram determined. Solomon also acknowledged why the arrangement was necessary. "You know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. The kingdom had laborers, administrators, wealth, and peace. Hiram's people had the specialized ability to select and cut the timber of Lebanon. The temple would require both. When Hiram heard Solomon's message, he rejoiced greatly. 'Blessed be the Lord this day,' he said, 'who has given to David a wise son to rule over this great people.'" Solomon's wisdom was now accomplishing something different from resolving a dispute or organizing districts. It was shaping an international agreement in which each kingdom supplied what the other possessed. Hiram answered that he had heard Solomon's request and would provide cedar and cypress timber. His servants would cut the trees in Lebanon and bring the logs down to the sea. There they would bind the timber into rafts and float it along the coast to the place Solomon designated. Hiram's workers would then break the rafts apart so that Solomon's men could receive the timber and transport it inland. In return, Hiram asked Solomon to provide food for his royal household. Solomon agreed. Year after year, he supplied Hiram's household with 20,000 cors of wheat and 20 cors of beaten oil. For the workers cutting timber, Solomon also committed great quantities of wheat, barley, wine, and oil. The exchange joined the agricultural abundance of Solomon's kingdom to the forests and skilled woodsmen under Hiram. Grain and oil moved toward Tyre, timber moved from Lebanon to the sea, and then toward the point from which it could be carried to Jerusalem. Peace existed between Solomon and Hiram, and the two kings made a treaty. The agreement went beyond timber. Solomon was planning both the house of the Lord and a royal house for himself, and the sacred project required craftsmen able to work with precious metals, stone, wood, colored yarn, and engraved designs. Solomon sent another request to Hiram. He described the purpose of the temple in detail. The house would be dedicated to the name of the Lord. Fragrant incense would be burned before him. The bread of the presence would be arranged regularly. Burnt offerings would be presented morning and evening, on Sabbaths, at new moons, and during the appointed feasts of the Lord. These practices belonged to Israel continually, and the house intended for them had to match the greatness of its purpose. "The house that I am to build will be great," Solomon said, "for our God is greater than all gods." Yet Solomon did not speak as if a building could contain God. "Who is able to build him a house, since heaven, even highest heaven, cannot contain him?" Solomon understood his own place within the work. He was not constructing a dwelling that could limit the God of heaven and earth. He was building a place where offerings would be made before him. "And who am I to build a house for him?" Solomon asked, "except as a place to make offerings before him." That distinction shaped the request he sent to Tyre. The scale of the building would express the greatness of the God worshipped there, while its function would remain centered on Israel's service before him. Solomon asked Hiram to send a craftsman skilled in working with gold, silver, bronze, and iron. The man also needed the ability to work with purple, crimson, and blue materials, and to execute engraved designs. He would work beside the skilled men already present in Judah and Jerusalem, craftsmen David had provided. Solomon also expanded his request for wood. He wanted cedar, cypress, and algum timber from Lebanon. Hiram's servants would join Solomon's servants because the Sidonian workers knew how to cut the trees. A great quantity was required. Solomon described the house he intended to build as both great and wonderful. Hiram answered in a letter, "Because the Lord loves his people, he has made you king over them." Hiram then blessed the Lord, the God of Israel, who made heaven and earth and gave David a wise son, endowed with discretion and understanding. That wisdom, Hiram said, would enable Solomon to build the house of the Lord and his own royal house. The king of Tyre agreed to send the requested craftsman. His name was Huram-Abi. His mother was from the daughters of Dan, and his father was a man of Tyre. He possessed skill in working with gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, and wood. He could also work with purple, blue, and crimson fabric and fine linen. He could execute engravings and carry out any design assigned to him. Huram-Abi would work with Solomon's craftsmen and with those David had prepared. The agreement now had three coordinated parts. Hiram would supply timber, Huram-Abi would bring wide-ranging craftsmanship. Solomon would provide food for the royal household and the workers. Hiram confirmed the transport plan. His servants would cut the timber in Lebanon, bring it to the sea, and bind it into rafts. The rafts would be floated to Joppa. From there, responsibility would pass to Solomon, who would have the timber carried up to Jerusalem. The journey of the cedar therefore depended on several distinct groups. Sidonian woodsmen cut the trees. Hiram's servants brought the logs to the coast and bound them for transport. The rafts moved by sea to Joppa. Solomon's labor force then carried the timber inland and uphill toward the building site. At the same time, Solomon organized the immense labor force required within Israel. He imposed a levy of 30,000 men from Israel. Adoniram, already responsible for forced labor, supervised them. The men were divided into rotating groups. 10,000 went to Lebanon for 1 month at a time. After a month in Lebanon, each group spent 2 months at home, while another group took its place. The rotation maintained a continuing Israelite workforce in the forests without sending all 30,000 away at once. Every month, 10,000 served in Lebanon. The other 20,000 were home, awaiting their next assigned month. The work in Lebanon was only one part of the project. Solomon had 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stonecutters working in the hill country. Thousands of officers supervised the labor and made sure the workers completed their assigned tasks. Solomon also counted the resident foreigners living in Israel, following the census David had made. Their total was 153,600. From that population, Solomon assigned 70,000 to carry loads, 80,000 to quarry stone in the hills, and 3,600 to oversee the labor. The numbers reveal the physical weight of the project. Timber had to be cut, moved down to the sea, floated to Joppa, and carried to Jerusalem. Stone had to be separated from the hills, shaped for construction, and transported to the temple site. Supervisors had to coordinate workers spread across forests, quarries, roads, and the city itself. Solomon ordered the quarrying of great and costly stones. These stones were dressed and prepared for the foundation of the house. The foundation required materials strong enough to carry everything Solomon intended to place above it. The temple would contain cedar, cypress, algum wood, bronze, iron, silver, gold, carved designs, and sacred furnishings. Before any of those could take their place, the base had to be cut from large, valuable stones and set securely. Solomon's builders worked with Hiram's builders and the men of Gebal. Together, they prepared both timber and stone. The partnership was now active at every level. 2 kings had agreed on terms. Workers in Lebanon cut wood. Seaborne crews formed and moved rafts. Carriers transported heavy material. Quarrymen cut stone. Craftsmen prepared to shape wood, metal, fabric, and ornament. Officers supervised the labor. Agricultural supplies supported the workers and Hiram's household. All of it converged on one place in Jerusalem. Solomon built the house of the Lord on Mount Moriah. This was where the Lord had appeared to David, at the place David had designated on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. The location connected the temple to an event already associated with David and the presence of God. Solomon did not choose a new royal center outside the city. The house would rise in Jerusalem at the appointed place on Mount Moriah. The beginning of construction was marked precisely. 480 years had passed since the people of Israel came out of Egypt. Solomon had entered the 4th year of his reign. In the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, on the 2nd day, he began to build the house of the Lord. The date joined Israel's royal present to its deliverance from Egypt. The people once brought out as a nation were now living under a king whose dominion stretched across kingdoms, whose officials governed a prosperous land, and whose resources could sustain one of the largest coordinated works of the reign. Yet the temple did not begin with gold. It began with labor agreements, food supplies, cut timber, quarried stone, and a foundation. Solomon's wisdom was visible in the order of the work. Before construction began, he secured access to the forests. Before the logs arrived, he arranged their transport. Before craftsmen were needed in Jerusalem, he asked Hiram for a man able to work beside those already prepared. Before the house rose, quarrymen cut the costly foundation stones. The treaty with Hiram also transformed David's old friendship into an active partnership under Solomon. Hiram had loved David. Now he recognized wisdom in David's son, praised the God who had placed him on the throne, and committed Tyrion's skill to Solomon's purpose. Solomon, in turn, honored the labor involved. He offered wages for the woodsmen and provisions for Hiram's household. His request depended on the workers' recognized expertise, not simply on the authority of kings. The scale was royal, but the tasks were exact. Someone had to swing the tools in Lebanon. Someone had to guide the timber to the sea. Someone had to bind the rafts. Someone had to cut stone in the hills. Someone had to carry each load. Someone had to direct thousands of workers without allowing the sequence to break. Adoniram oversaw the Israelite levy. The district structure already supporting Solomon's court could now sustain a project drawing men and resources across the kingdom. The peace surrounding Israel allowed those men to build rather than defend the borders from constant attack. Solomon's explanation to Hiram had made that connection plain. David had faced warfare and could not build. Solomon had received rest, and rest created the opening for construction. But rest did not make the work small. 30,000 Israelites rotated through service in Lebanon. 70,000 carried burdens, 80,000 cut stone, thousands supervised them. Resident foreigners were counted and assigned. Hiram's servants labored from forest to coast, while Solomon's men received their work and carried it toward Jerusalem. The project joined worship to administration. Solomon intended the house for incense, the bread of the presence, daily offerings, Sabbaths, new moons, and appointed feasts. Yet accomplishing that sacred purpose required treaties, measurements, payments, schedules, food, transport, and human labor. Nothing about the practical work reduced the purpose Solomon had declared. The heavens could not contain God. The house would not contain him either. It would provide the appointed place for Israel to offer before him, and its greatness would testify to the greatness Solomon confessed. The location deepened that purpose. Mount Moriah was not simply available land within Jerusalem, it was the place connected with God's appearance to David, the threshing floor David had designated. Solomon's foundation took shape where his father's encounter and preparation had already directed him. By the 2nd day of the 2nd month in Solomon's 4th year, preparation became construction. The great stones were ready, the timber was being supplied, the craftsmen had been appointed, The labor forces had been divided and placed under supervision. Hiram and Solomon were bound by peace and agreement. Jerusalem had become the destination of resources moving from forests, hills, fields, workshops, and the sea. For years, the house had existed as an intention attached to David's line. Now, its foundation lay upon Mount Moriah. Above those stones, Solomon was ready to build. The house took shape according to precise dimensions. Using the former standard of measurement, it was 60 cubits long and 20 cubits wide. The main structure rose 30 cubits high. A porch extended across the front, matching the 20-cubit width of the house and projecting 10 cubits outward. Its great height rose above the main approach, and its interior was overlaid with pure gold. Solomon made recessed windows with frames for the house. Around the outer walls, he built a structure of side chambers against both the main hall and the inner sanctuary. These chambers rose in 3 levels. The lowest level was 5 cubits wide, the middle level 6, and the third level 7. Solomon built ledges into the outside of the temple wall so the supporting beams of the side structure would not have to be inserted into the sacred walls themselves. An entrance on the south side gave access to the lowest level. Winding stairs led upward to the middle level and then to the third. The widening of each successive story allowed the chambers to rest securely around the central building without cutting deeply into its walls. Cedar beams joined the side structure to the house, while each level provided space surrounding the main rooms. The stonework followed an equally deliberate process. The stones were prepared and finished at the quarry before they reached Mount Moriah. As a result, no hammer, axe, or other iron tool was heard at the house while it was being built. The great stones arrived ready to be placed. The quiet at the building itself did not mean that the work required little effort. Quarrymen had already cut and dressed each stone in the hills. Burden bearers had moved it. Supervisors had directed its journey. By the time the material reached the temple, the loud shaping had been completed elsewhere. Solomon built the walls and covered the house with beams and boards of cedar. Inside, he lined the walls with cedar from the floor upward. The floor itself was covered with cypress. The use of wood transformed the interior. The great stones formed the strength of the building, but they disappeared beneath cedar and cypress. Carvings of gourds and open flowers covered the cedar. Within the house, the stone surfaces were no longer visible. The principal hall before the inner sanctuary was 40 cubits long. Behind it, Solomon set apart the innermost room, 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high. This was the most holy place, prepared to receive the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. The proportions formed a perfect cube. Its length, width, and height were equal. Solomon lined it with cedar and overlaid it with fine gold. 600 talents of gold were used upon its surfaces. Gold covered the upper chambers. Even the nails were made with gold, weighing 50 shekels. The gold came from the wealth gathered into Solomon's kingdom, including gold associated with Parvaim. It covered beams, thresholds, walls, and doors. Precious stones also adorned the house, and carved palm trees and chains appeared across the interior. The main room was lined with cypress and covered with fine gold. Palm trees and chain designs decorated it. The beams above, the thresholds below, and the walls surrounding the worshipper all carried the same costly material. Solomon overlaid the floor with gold as well. Gold was not limited to small objects that could be carried from the house. It covered the fixed structure beneath and around them. The altar belonging to the inner sanctuary was made of cedar and covered with gold. Golden chains stretched across the front of the inner room. Solomon continued until the inside of the entire house had been overlaid with gold. Yet while the structure was rising and its surfaces were being covered, the Lord spoke to Solomon. The message began with the building itself, concerning this house that you are building. The promise that followed did not rest on architecture alone. Solomon was to walk in God's statutes, obey his rules, keep all his commandments and walk in them. If he did, the Lord would establish with Solomon the word he had spoken to David. God would dwell among the people of Israel and would not forsake them. The condition entered the construction before the temple was finished. Solomon could build walls of prepared stone, line them with cedar, and cover them with gold. He could shape a place for offerings and prepare the inner sanctuary for the ark. But the future of God's presence among Israel remained connected to obedience. The house was not presented to Solomon as a substitute for walking in God's ways. The temple and the covenant belonged together. Its magnificence would not cancel the statutes, rules, and commandments the king had been charged to keep. Solomon received that word while directing a building intended for the name of the Lord. He continued the work. Inside the most holy place, he made 2 enormous cherubim from olive wood. Each stood 10 cubits high. The wings of the first cherub extended 10 cubits from tip to tip. One wing measured 5 cubits and reached toward one wall. The other measured 5 cubits and stretched toward the center of the room. The second cherub had the same dimensions. One wing reached the opposite wall, while the other extended inward. Together, their outstretched wings spanned the full 20-cubit width of the most holy place. The inner wings touched one another at the center. The outer wings touched the walls on either side. The cherubim stood on their feet and faced the main room. Solomon overlaid them with gold. Their scale matched the room prepared for them. Each figure rose half the height of the sanctuary. Their combined wings reached from wall to wall, forming a golden span above the place intended for the ark. Solomon also carved cherubim upon the walls, along with palm trees and open flowers. These designs appeared in both the inner and outer rooms. A veil was made from blue, purple, and crimson yarn with fine linen. Cherubim were worked into it. The inner sanctuary also had doors of olive wood. Their lintel and doorposts were made from the same wood. Solomon carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers upon the doors and covered the carvings with gold. The entrance to the main hall had olive wood doorposts and 2 doors made of cypress. Each door had 2 folding leaves. These doors also carried carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, all overlaid with gold. The repeated designs joined the entrances to the walls within. A person approaching the house passed through doors bearing the same cherubim, palms, and flowers that covered the interior. Beyond them stood the great golden cherubim inside the most holy place. Solomon built the inner court with 3 courses of cut stone and 1 course of cedar beams. The temple was becoming a sequence of increasingly restricted spaces. The porch opened toward the main hall. The hall extended 40 cubits toward the rear. Doors and a veil marked the approach to the inner sanctuary. Within that cubic room, the golden cherubim stretched their wings across the full width. Each material had a defined role. Great stones carried the weight. Cedar covered the walls and ceiling. Cypress covered the floor and formed the folding doors. Olive wood shaped the cherubim and inner doors. Gold covered the most sacred surfaces. Fine linen and colored yarn formed the veil. The craftsmanship Hiram had supplied worked beside the skill already present in Jerusalem. Carvers cut palms, flowers, chains, and cherubim. Woodworkers shaped beams, panels, doors, and enormous figures. Metalworkers prepared the gold covering and the golden nails that fixed it in place. The work required exact alignment. The chambers widened as they rose. Their beams met ledges built into the outer wall. The inner sanctuary fit within a 20-cubit cube. The cherubim stood at equal height, their inner wings meeting at the center, while their outer wings reached the walls. The house's measurements also reflected its purpose. The main hall occupied the larger portion of the building, but the innermost room received the greatest concentration of gold and symbolic workmanship. The ark would stand beneath the wings of the cherubim in the place Solomon had prepared for it. Outside that room, the house remained richly finished. Cedar carvings covered the walls. Gold covered the floor, thresholds, doors, and beams. precious stones added further ornament. The sanctuary was not a plain shell surrounding a single decorated chamber. The whole interior had been shaped as sacred space. Still, the movement toward the most holy place increased the intensity. Gold gave way to more gold. Carved cherubim on the walls gave way to the great standing cherubim. The long hall led to the perfect cube. The veil and doors marked the final separation. The external side chambers added another layer around that progression. 3 levels wrapped the main hall and inner sanctuary. Their varying widths allowed them to rise against the temple while the central walls remained intact. Solomon finished the side structure with cedar timbers. He roofed the house with cedar beams and boards. The completed building joined massive stone below with carefully fitted wood above. The absence of iron tool noise at the site distinguished the placement of the stones from their preparation. Mount Moriah received finished pieces. The sound of cutting remained in the quarry while the temple rose through the assembly of material already shaped for its position. That method required planning before each stone arrived. A block brought to the site had to match the place waiting for it. The builders could not depend on trimming every piece against the wall after delivery. Measurement guided quarrying, transport, and placement as one connected operation. The same precision governed the interior. Doorways had to receive their frames. Cedar had to cover the stone. Gold had to be fitted over carved designs. The cherubim had to stand so their wings met one another without exceeding the room. Solomon had begun with a declaration that the heavens, even the highest heavens, could not contain God. The temple's exact dimensions did not contradict that confession. The measurements defined the place of Israel's worship, not the limits of the God they worshipped. The word Solomon received during construction reinforced the same boundary. God promised to dwell among Israel, but the king was commanded to walk in obedience. The building could serve the covenant, it could not replace it. That condition stood inside a reign already marked by wisdom, wealth, and power. Solomon had asked for discernment and received it. He had organized Israel and extended his dominion. He had secured cedar from Lebanon and costly stones from the hills. Now the Lord directed his attention beyond the achievement itself to the life he would live after the house was complete. The temple would become Solomon's greatest physical work, but the promise concerning it still required the king's faithfulness. Construction continued across 7 years. Solomon had laid the foundation in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month of his 4th year as king. The work moved through the stone structure, side chambers, roof, interior paneling, inner sanctuary, doors, veil, carvings, and gold covering. In the 11th year of Solomon's reign, during the month of Bul, the 8th month, the house was finished in all its parts and according to all its specifications. 7 years had passed from foundation to completion. The result stood on Mount Moriah, a 60-cubit house of prepared stone and cedar, surrounded by rising chambers, approached through a great porch, and ordered around a golden inner sanctuary. Within that sanctuary, 2 cherubim stood beneath gold, their wings reaching wall to wall. Carved cherubim, palms, flowers, and chains covered doors and walls. A woven veil marked the sacred boundary. The ark had a place prepared beneath the outstretched wings. The building also carried a spoken condition no visitor could see in its stone or gold. Solomon's obedience remained essential to the promise attached to the house. The Lord would establish his word and dwell among Israel as the king walked in his statutes, kept his commandments, and lived within them. For now, Solomon had completed the structure exactly as planned. The stones were set. The rooms were enclosed, the cedar was carved, the gold was in place. The house stood ready for the rest of the work that would surround and serve its innermost room. Solomon also built a royal complex for himself, and that work continued for 13 years. The largest building was called the House of the Forest of Lebanon. It measured 100 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Rows of cedar pillars supported cedar beams, and 45 roof beams were arranged in 3 rows of 15. Window frames stood in 3 tiers, facing one another across the hall. The abundance of cedar gave the building its name and character. Pillars, beams, roofing, and paneled surfaces made the royal hall resemble the great timber source from which its material had come. Beside it stood the Hall of Pillars, 50 cubits long and 30 cubits wide. A porch with pillars and a canopy extended in front. Solomon also built the Hall of the Throne, where he delivered judgment. It was therefore called the Hall of Judgment. Cedar paneling covered it from floor to ceiling. His own residence stood in another court behind that hall and followed a similar design. He built a separate house of the same workmanship for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. The buildings were made from costly stone, cut to precise measurements, and sawed on both inner and outer faces. Great foundation stones supported them, some measuring 10 cubits and others 8. Above those foundations rose additional courses of costly stone and cedar. The great court was enclosed with 3 courses of cut stone and 1 course of cedar beams. The same pattern appeared around the inner court of the house of the Lord and its entrance porch. The temple and palace complex, therefore, belonged to one enormous transformation of Jerusalem. Sacred courts, royal halls, judicial space, residences, and fortified stonework rose through carefully measured material. When the buildings required their great works of bronze, Solomon brought Huram from Tyre. Huram's father had been a Tyrian worker in bronze. Huram possessed wisdom, understanding, and skill for every kind of bronze work. He came to Solomon and undertook the designs assigned to him. His first monumental work stood at the entrance of the temple. Huram cast 2 bronze pillars. Each pillar was 18 cubits high and 12 cubits in circumference. He made 2 cast bronze capitals, each 5 cubits high, to crown them. The capitals were covered with interwoven latticework and wreaths of chainwork. Rows of bronze pomegranates surrounded them, forming ornamental bands around the tops of the pillars. Hundreds of pomegranates were arranged in rows across the 2 capitals. Above them, the capitals were shaped like lilies. Huram erected 1 pillar on the right side of the temple entrance and named it Jachin. He raised the other on the left and named it Boaz. The names stood with the pillars at the threshold. Anyone approaching the temple passed between these 2 works of bronze, rising beneath their decorated capitals of chains, pomegranates, and lilies. Huram then made the great bronze altar. It was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 10 cubits high. The square altar stood before the house as the place for Israel's offerings. Its width matched the width of the temple itself, while its height raised the place of sacrifice above the surrounding court. Another bronze work provided water on an equally imposing scale. Huram cast a great basin called the Sea. It was circular, 10 cubits from rim to rim, 5 cubits high, and 30 cubits in circumference. Beneath its rim ran 2 rows of figures shaped like gourds, 10 to each cubit. They had been cast as part of the sea itself rather than attached afterward. The basin stood upon 12 bronze oxen. 3 faced north, 3 faced west, 3 faced south, and 3 faced east. Their hindquarters turned inward beneath the basin, while their heads faced outward in every direction. The wall of the sea was a handbreadth thick. Its rim curved like the rim of a cup and opened like a lily blossom. It was made to hold thousands of baths of water. The sea was placed on the southeast side of the temple. Its water served the priests for washing. The sacrificial work at the altar required cleansing, and the immense basin provided for those who carried out that service. Huram also made 10 smaller bronze basins. These had a different purpose. The parts of the burnt offerings were rinsed in them. Each basin held 40 baths and measured 4 cubits across. But these basins did not rest directly on the court pavement. Each stood upon a wheeled bronze stand, designed with the same care as the temple's larger works. There were 10 stands in all. Each measured 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. Frames held panels along their sides. Lions, oxen, and cherubim decorated the panels. Wreaths appeared above and below the animal figures. Each stand had 4 bronze wheels with bronze axles. Supports rose from its corners to hold the basin above, and cast wreaths decorated those supports. A circular opening at the top received the basin. Engraved designs covered the surface around it, while the side panels remained square. The wheels resembled chariot wheels. Their axles, rims, spokes, and hubs were cast from bronze. Each wheel stood 1.5 cubits high. The 4 supports and the stand itself were cast as one piece. Every stand followed the same measurement and design. Huram placed 5 stands on the south side of the temple and 5 on the north. 1 basin rested on each stand. The arrangement distributed water across both sides of the court. The Great Sea served the priests, while the 10 movable basins served the washing connected with burnt offerings. The wheels allowed the smaller basins to stand on mobile platforms, yet their decoration matched the sacred environment around them. Lions, oxen, cherubim, and wreaths appeared on objects built for repeated practical use. Huram also made pots, shovels, and bowls. These tools belonged to the work surrounding the altar, where ashes, sacrifices, and blood required vessels suited to each task. By the time Huram finished, his bronze work included the 2 pillars, the bowl-shaped capitals on their tops, the lattice work covering the capitals, and the rows of pomegranates. It included the 10 wheeled stands and 10 basins, the sea and the 12 oxen beneath it, and the pots, shovels, and bowls used in service. The pieces were made from polished bronze. Huram cast them in the plain of the Jordan, in clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan. The clay provided the setting in which the immense forms could be cast before they were brought to Jerusalem. The quantity of bronze was so great that Solomon did not weigh it. Its total weight remained undetermined. This bronze gave the temple court a different character from the golden interior. Inside the house, gold covered floors, walls, beams, doors, and the inner sanctuary. Outside, bronze shaped the altar, pillars, sea, stands, basins, and tools. The contrast followed the work performed in each place. The inner rooms centered on the ark, incense, bread, and lamps. The outer court centered on sacrifice, water, washing, and movement. Solomon also ordered the courts themselves completed. There was a court for the priests and a great outer court. Doors for the court were covered with bronze. The priests' court enclosed the area of their appointed service, while the larger court extended the temple complex outward. The bronze-covered doors marked entry into the spaces surrounding the house. Inside, the remaining furnishings were made of gold. Solomon made the golden altar used for incense. He made tables on which the bread of the presence would be placed. He made 10 lampstands of pure gold according to their prescribed design. 5 stood on the south side of the inner room and 5 on the north. With them were golden flowers, lamps, and tongs. The lamps provided light within the house, arranged in balanced groups on either side. Their flowers and branches were shaped in gold, while the tongs allowed those serving inside to tend them. Solomon also made 100 golden basins, along with cups, snuffers, bowls, dishes for incense, and fire pans. Even the sockets for the temple doors were made of gold, the doors leading into the most holy place, and the doors entering the main hall. The furnishings now matched the surfaces surrounding them. A golden lampstand stood upon a golden floor beneath gold-covered beams. Golden utensils served a golden altar. Gold sockets received doors already covered with gold. None of those objects had been included merely to fill the rooms. Each belonged to a task Solomon had named when he first wrote to Hiram: incense before the Lord, the regular arrangement of the bread, burnt offerings, appointed feasts, and continuing worship. The bronze objects supported the sacrifices and washings outside. The golden objects supported the service within. The two pillars gave the temple a monumental entrance, but they did not support the roof of the inner sanctuary. They stood before the house as named works, Jachin and Boaz, each crowned with 5-cubit capitals. The decorative language of the temple continued across metal as it had across wood. The interior walls carried cherubim, palms, flowers, and chains. The bronze capitals carried chains, pomegranates, and lilies. The stands carried lions, oxen, cherubim, and wreaths. Huram's ability to work across designs and forms allowed practical objects to belong visually to the same sacred complex. A wheeled basin and a towering pillar differed in function, but each was shaped with deliberate ornament. The great altar, however, declared its purpose primarily through size. 20 cubits by 20, it formed a broad square before the temple. The sea beside it held enough water for the priests, while the 10 basins distributed water for cleansing the offerings. Sacrifice and washing therefore occupied major physical space outside the house. The temple was not designed only for people to look toward golden rooms. Its courts were built for the repeated work Solomon had described: offerings morning and evening, offerings on Sabbaths and new moons, and offerings during Israel's appointed feasts. The buildings surrounding the temple also revealed how much Solomon's reign had expanded. The house of the Lord had taken 7 years. His own royal complex required 13. The palace included more than private rooms. It contained the Hall of Judgment, where Solomon sat to decide cases. It contained the House of the Forest of Lebanon, with its ranks of cedar pillars and beams. It included the Hall of Pillars, his residence, the residence of Pharaoh's daughter, and the courts joining these spaces. The expensive stonework extended from foundation to roofline. Great blocks carried cedar halls above them, and cut stone enclosed the courts. The palace complex made Solomon's administration physical. Judgment had a hall. Royal receptions had great spaces. The king's household had its own residence. Pharaoh's daughter had hers. Officials, guards, servants, and those approaching the throne moved through buildings created for the life of the monarchy. The temple made Israel's worship physical in a different way. Offerings had an altar. Priests had a court and water for washing. Bread had its tables. Lamps had their stands. Incense had its golden altar. The ark had the most holy place. Both complexes required the same kingdom to sustain them. Stonecutters, carriers, metalworkers, woodworkers, weavers, engravers, supervisors, and foreign partners had all contributed. Timber came from Lebanon. Bronze was cast in the Jordan Plain. Gold and precious stones covered the interior. Great blocks were cut for Jerusalem's foundations. Solomon's wisdom had brought those materials and skills together without confusing their purposes. Hiram supplied timber. Huram shaped bronze. Israelite craftsmen worked in wood, metal, fabric, and stone. Labor forces moved what the craftsmen needed. Royal officers oversaw the demands placed upon the kingdom. At last, the work Solomon had directed for the house of the Lord was finished. He then brought in the silver, gold, and vessels David had dedicated. Solomon placed them in the treasuries of the house of God. David's prepared gifts had waited through the years when he could not build. Solomon now carried them into the completed temple and stored them among its sacred treasures. The movement joined father and son without confusing their roles. David had dedicated the wealth. Solomon had built the house and brought the dedicated objects inside. The temple now possessed its structure, courts, altar, pillars, water basins, lampstands, tables, utensils, and treasures. Its inner sanctuary had been built for the ark. The great cherubim already stretched their golden wings from wall to wall above the place prepared for it. But the ark still remained where David had placed it in Jerusalem. The completed house had not yet received the object for which its innermost room had been made. Solomon now summoned the elders of Israel, the heads of the tribes, and the chiefs of the ancestral houses to Jerusalem. They were to bring the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord up from the city of David, which was Zion. The assembly gathered before the king during the feast in the 7th month. Representatives from across Israel had come to witness the movement of the ark from the tent David had prepared into the permanent house Solomon had built. When the elders arrived, the priests lifted the ark. The priests and Levites also carried the tent of meeting and all the sacred vessels that had been inside it. The movement joined the two centers that had existed during Solomon's early reign. The tabernacle and its vessels were brought into the new complex, while the ark came up from Zion. Objects associated with Israel's worship were being gathered into one house on Mount Moriah. Solomon and the entire congregation of Israel assembled before the ark. As it moved toward the temple, they sacrificed sheep and oxen in such abundance that the animals could not be counted. The procession was not simply carrying a chest from one tent into another building. The ark contained the covenant tablets and represented the central promise around which Solomon had constructed the most holy place. The sacrifices accompanied it as priests bore it toward the golden room waiting beneath the cherubim. The priests carried the ark into the inner sanctuary. They passed through the main hall and brought it into the most holy place. There they set it beneath the wings of the great cherubim. The cherubim stretched their wings over the place of the ark. Their wings covered both the ark and its carrying poles from above. The poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, though they were not visible from outside the house. The poles remained in position. Inside the ark were the 2 stone tablets Moses had placed there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel after bringing them out of Egypt. Gold covered the room around them. Gold covered the floor below, the walls on every side, and the wings above. But the central objects were the ark and the tablets of the covenant it contained. The placement completed a movement extending across generations. The tablets had been placed in the ark at Horeb. David had brought the ark into Jerusalem and prepared a tent for it. Solomon had built a permanent inner sanctuary, and the priests now set the ark in that room. The sacred vessels had been brought from the tent of meeting. The treasures David dedicated had already been placed in the temple storerooms. The ark now rested beneath the wings, prepared for it. As the priests came out of the holy place, singers and musicians stood ready near the altar. The Levitical singers included Asaph, Heman, Jeduthun, their sons, and their relatives. They were dressed in fine linen. They carried cymbals, harps, and lyres. With them stood 120 priests sounding trumpets. The musicians stood east of the altar. Trumpeters and singers joined together and made themselves heard with one voice. Cymbals, trumpets, and other instruments accompanied their praise. They thanked the Lord with the words, "For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." Then the house was filled with a cloud. The cloud occupied the temple so completely that the priests could not stand to continue their service. The glory of the Lord filled the house of God. 7 years of construction had produced stone walls, cedar chambers, golden rooms, carved doors, courts, pillars, altars, basins, tables, and lampstands. Yet the moment that overwhelmed the priests came only after the ark entered and united praise rose before the Lord. The cloud made the divine response visible without placing an image of God inside the sanctuary. The priests had carried the ark beneath the cherubim, but they could not remain in the room once the glory filled the house. Solomon looked upon what had happened and spoke. "The Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness." The cloud had interrupted the priest's service, but Solomon recognized it as the presence for which the house had been prepared. "I have indeed built you an exalted house," he continued, "a place for you to dwell in forever." His words did not claim that the building contained the full being of God. Solomon had already confessed that heaven and the highest heaven could not contain him. He was identifying the temple as the place God had chosen for his name and presence among Israel. Solomon then turned away from the house and faced the assembled people. The congregation stood before him as he blessed them. These were the elders, tribal heads, ancestral leaders, priests, Levites, musicians, and people who had gathered for the feast and followed the ark into the temple complex. They had seen the sacrifices, heard the unified praise, and watched the cloud fill the house. Solomon began by blessing the Lord, the God of Israel. God had spoken to David and had now fulfilled that promise by his own hand. Solomon described the long movement that had led to this day. From the time God brought Israel out of Egypt, he had not chosen a city from among all the tribes in which to build a house for his name. He had chosen David to rule his people. He had also chosen Jerusalem as the place where his name would be established. David had wanted to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. The desire had been in David's heart, and God had told him that he did well to desire it. Yet David would not be the one to build. His son, born to him and placed upon his throne, would construct the house. Solomon now stood before Israel as that son. "The Lord has fulfilled his promise that he made," Solomon said. He had risen in David's place and sat upon the throne of Israel as God had promised. He had built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, and within that house he had set a place for the ark containing the covenant the Lord made with Israel when he brought them out of Egypt. Every part of Solomon's explanation joined a promise to its visible fulfillment. God had promised that David's son would reign. Solomon sat upon David's throne. God had said that the son would build. The house stood complete on Mount Moriah. God had chosen Jerusalem for his name. The sanctuary rose within Jerusalem. Solomon had prepared a place for the ark. The ark now rested beneath the cherubim. The musicians had praised the enduring, steadfast love of the Lord. The glory had filled the house. This was the highest public recognition Solomon's construction had yet received. Hiram had praised Solomon's wisdom. Workers had completed the building according to its specifications. Priests had placed every sacred object where it belonged. But the cloud established that the temple had become more than a finished royal project. The presence of God had entered it. The priests' inability to continue serving made the moment unmistakable. Their appointed work mattered, but the glory filling the house did not depend upon their ability to remain standing inside it. Solomon's speech gave the assembly the meaning of what they had witnessed. The temple represented neither Solomon's greatness alone, nor David's unrealized desire alone. It stood because God had spoken, chosen, and fulfilled. David had intended to build, prepared resources, and dedicated treasure. Solomon had inherited the commission, organized the labor, formed the agreement with Hiram, laid the foundation, and completed the house. Yet Solomon placed the decisive action with the Lord, who had fulfilled by his hand what he had promised with his mouth. That recognition prevented the king from presenting the temple as a monument arising from royal ambition alone. Solomon's position, the choice of Jerusalem, the building commission, and the covenant represented by the ark all stood within God's promise. The ark was central because it carried the tablets of that covenant. Gold, cedar, bronze, and costly stones surrounded it, but the tablets explained the relationship the house was built to serve. The cloud was central because it demonstrated that the Lord had occupied the place prepared for his name. The cherubim stretched their wings above the ark, but the priests themselves withdrew before the glory. The assembly was central because this was not a private dedication inside Solomon's palace. Israel's leaders had gathered from every tribe and ancestral house. The people stood while the king blessed them and declared what God had done. Solomon's words also connected deliverance and kingship. He spoke of Israel's departure from Egypt, the covenant placed inside the ark, the selection of David, the choice of Jerusalem, and the building completed by David's son. These were not separate royal achievements. They converged in the house now filled with cloud. The timing during the feast placed the event before an Israel already gathered for worship. Sacrifices accompanied the ark in numbers beyond counting. Singers and trumpeters spoke with one voice. The king stood before the congregation and blessed the God of Israel. Yet the glory filling the temple raised a question larger than construction. Solomon had built a place for the ark, but the covenant inside the ark included commandments Israel had to keep. He had built an altar for sacrifices, but sacrifices existed because worship and human failure had to be addressed. He had built a place for God's name, but God could not be confined within walls. The king had already been warned that the promise attached to the house remained connected to obedience. Now he stood before a nation that would face judgment, drought, war, sickness, and exile if it turned away. The cloud revealed that God was present. Solomon still had to ask how Israel could approach that presence when the people needed justice, forgiveness, and restoration. His blessing had looked backward to the promise fulfilled. His next words would have to look outward toward the lives of the people standing before him and forward toward the dangers they would face. The completed temple gave Israel a place to bring offerings. The ark gave the temple its covenant center. The glory gave the dedication its divine answer. But a house filled with glory was also a place before which guilty people would need mercy. Solomon had finished explaining why the temple stood and how the Lord had fulfilled his promise to David. He now had to turn from blessing the assembly to addressing the God whose glory had entered the house. Solomon took his place before the altar of the Lord in the presence of the entire assembly. A bronze platform had been made for him in the court, 5 cubits long, 5 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. He stood upon it, knelt before the congregation, and spread his hands toward heaven. O Lord, God of Israel, there is no God like you, in heaven above or on earth beneath. Solomon began with the covenant faithfulness already visible around him. God kept steadfast love with servants who walked before him with all their heart. He had kept his promise to David. What he had spoken with his mouth, he had fulfilled by his hand. Then Solomon asked God to continue the promise concerning David's descendants. David would not lack a man to sit upon Israel's throne if his sons watched their way and walked in God's law as David had walked. Now, therefore, O Lord, God of Israel, let your word be confirmed. The temple demonstrated that one promise had been fulfilled. Solomon asked that the promise concerning David's royal house also stand, yet he repeated the condition attached to it. David's sons had to watch their conduct before God. Solomon then faced the mystery at the center of the building he had completed. Will God indeed dwell with man on the earth? The heavens could not contain him. Even the highest heaven could not contain him. The house Solomon had built could not do so either. Still, Solomon asked God to pay attention to his servant's prayer. He asked him to hear the cry being offered before him and to keep his eyes open toward the temple day and night, toward the place where he had chosen to set his name. Solomon would pray toward that place. Israel would pray toward that place. God would hear from heaven, his dwelling place. And when you hear, Solomon said, forgive. That request opened into a series of dangers Israel would face. The first concerned justice between one person and another. If someone sinned against a neighbor and was required to take an oath, and the oath came before God's altar in the temple, Solomon asked God to hear from heaven and judge between his servants. The guilty were to be condemned, with their conduct returned upon their own heads. The righteous were to be justified and treated according to their righteousness. Solomon had once asked for an understanding heart to distinguish good from evil. Now he acknowledged that final knowledge of guilt belonged to God. Israel's courts could bring an oath before the altar, but Solomon asked the God of heaven to act with perfect justice. Then he turned to national defeat. If Israel was struck down before an enemy because the people had sinned, the defeat would expose more than military weakness. But if they turned back, acknowledged God's name, prayed, and pleaded in the temple, Solomon asked God to hear from heaven. He asked him to forgive Israel's sin and bring the people back to the land given to them and their fathers. Next came drought. If the heavens were shut and rain did not fall because Israel had sinned, and the people prayed toward the temple, acknowledged God's name, and turned from their sin when he afflicted them, Solomon asked him to hear. He asked God to forgive his servants and his people Israel, teach them the good way in which they should walk, and send rain upon the land he had given them as an inheritance. The temple would therefore stand in the center of consequences that reached fields, families, and the future of the nation. A closed heaven would not be answered merely by a royal command. The people would have to turn, confess, and seek the God whose name rested upon the house. Solomon continued through disasters that could strike the land in other forms. Famine, pestilence, blight, mildew, locusts, caterpillars, an enemy besieging Israel's cities, plague, sickness. Whatever prayer or plea was made by an individual or by all Israel, each person knowing the affliction and sorrow of his own heart and stretching out his hands toward the house, Solomon asked God to hear from heaven. He asked him to forgive and act. God was to repay each person according to his ways, because God alone knew the human heart. The purpose of that response was not limited to relief from one emergency. Solomon wanted Israel to fear God and walk in his ways throughout the days they lived in the land given to their fathers. The king, standing before the temple, governed through officers, judges, armies, and district administrators, yet he confessed that only God knew every heart. The temple would gather many people into the same courts, but each would come with a personal affliction, known fully to God. Solomon then looked beyond Israel. A foreigner might come from a distant country after hearing of God's great name, mighty hand, and outstretched arm. That foreigner might pray toward the temple. Solomon asked God to hear from heaven and do according to everything the foreigner requested. The reason reached across nations. All the peoples of the earth would know God's name and fear him as Israel did. They would know that the house Solomon had built was called by his name. The temple stood in Jerusalem, but Solomon's prayer did not limit its significance to people born within Israel. Foreigners who heard and came were included in his request for divine attention. Solomon next prayed about war. When Israel went out against an enemy along the way God sent them, the people would pray toward Jerusalem, the city God had chosen, and toward the house built for his name. Solomon asked God to hear their prayer and uphold their cause. The army might be far from Mount Moriah. Its soldiers might face an enemy beyond sight of the temple. Their prayer could still be directed toward the chosen city and the house containing the Ark of the Covenant. Then Solomon reached the most severe possibility. When they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them and give them to an enemy. Israel could be defeated and carried captive into another land, whether near or far. The people could find themselves under the power of those who had taken them away. If they came to their senses in the land of their captivity, repented, and pleaded with God, saying, "We have sinned and acted perversely and wickedly," Solomon asked him to hear. Their return had to involve the whole person. If they turned to God with all their heart and soul in the land of their enemies, they would pray toward the land given to their fathers, toward the city God had chosen, and toward the house Solomon had built. From heaven, God was to hear their prayer and pleas, uphold their cause, and forgive his people who had sinned against him. Solomon also asked God to grant them compassion before those who held them captive. Israel remained God's people and inheritance, the people he had brought out of Egypt, out of the iron furnace. Solomon asked him to keep his eyes open to their pleas and listen whenever they called. The king's prayer had moved from one disputed oath to the removal of an entire nation. It passed through defeat, drought, famine, disease, siege, war, captivity, repentance, and return. In every case, the temple served as the direction of prayer, while heaven remained the place from which God heard. The building mattered because God had placed his name there. Forgiveness still came from the God no building could contain. Solomon closed his prayer by calling upon the Lord to arise and enter his resting place with the ark of his might. He asked that God's priests be clothed with salvation and that his faithful people rejoice in goodness. He asked God not to turn away the face of his anointed king, but to remember the steadfast love shown to David. Then Solomon rose from before the altar, where he had knelt with his hands spread toward heaven. He stood and blessed the entire assembly of Israel in a loud voice. Blessed be the Lord, who has given rest to his people Israel, according to all that he promised. Not one word had failed from all the good promise given through Moses. Solomon asked that the Lord be with Israel, as he had been with their fathers. He asked God not to leave or forsake them, but to incline their hearts toward himself, so they would walk in all his ways and keep his commandments, statutes, and rules. The petitions Solomon had made were to remain near the Lord, day and night. God was to uphold the cause of his servant and his people, as each day required. Then all the peoples of the earth would know that the Lord is God, and that there is no other. Solomon ended his blessing with an appeal to the people themselves. Let your heart therefore be wholly true to the Lord our God, walking in his statutes and keeping his commandments. The temple dedication had reached its human condition. God had kept his word. Solomon had built. The glory had filled the house. But Israel's future still required hearts wholly devoted to the Lord. The dedication also received a visible answer from heaven. Fire came down and consumed the burnt offering and sacrifices. The glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priests could not enter the house because the glory had filled it. When the people of Israel saw the fire descend and the glory rest upon the temple, they bowed low with their faces to the pavement. They worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord. For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. The words sung when the cloud first filled the house now rose from the people who had seen fire fall upon the offerings. Solomon and the entire assembly then offered sacrifices before the Lord. The scale exceeded the capacity of ordinary preparation. Solomon offered 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep. The king and all the people dedicated the house of God. Priests stood at their appointed posts. The Levites stood with musical instruments David had made for giving thanks to the Lord. Trumpeters sounded opposite them while Israel stood. The music, sacrifices, and gathered people filled the temple courts with the continuing work for which those courts had been designed. The bronze altar Solomon had made was too small to receive all the burnt offerings, grain offerings, and fat from the peace offerings. Solomon consecrated the middle of the court before the house of the Lord and presented offerings there as well. The immense altar had matched the width of the temple, but the dedication surpassed even that provision. The court itself had to be set apart to accommodate the sacrifices. Solomon and Israel celebrated the dedication for 7 days. The feast continued for another 7 days, making 14 days of assembly. The people had come from a vast distance, from Lebo Hamath in the north to the brook of Egypt in the south. The same kingdom, organized through 12 provision districts, now stood represented around the temple. A solemn assembly marked the completion of the celebration. On the 23rd day of the 7th month, Solomon dismissed the people to their homes. They blessed the king and returned to their tents joyful and glad in heart because of the goodness the Lord had shown to David, to Solomon, and to Israel his people. The house had been built, filled with glory, and dedicated through prayer, sacrifice, music, and feast. Solomon had asked God to hear Israel in every condition, from peace to exile. Fire had consumed the offerings, and the people had bowed before the Lord. But Solomon's prayer had repeatedly joined promise to obedience. He had asked God to continue David's throne, forgive a repentant people, and keep his eyes open toward the temple. The celebration had displayed acceptance. The king still awaited the divine answer that would define the conditions under which the house and his dynasty would endure. The answer came after Solomon had completed the house of the Lord, his own royal house, and everything he had desired to accomplish in those buildings. The Lord appeared to him at night for the second time, as he had appeared at Gibeon. At Gibeon, Solomon had been invited to ask for a gift, and he had requested wisdom to govern Israel. This appearance concerned what Solomon had done with the peace, wealth, and authority that followed. I have heard your prayer and your plea, which you have made before me. The dedication had not ended with words rising toward a silent heaven. The Lord affirmed that he had heard Solomon. He had chosen and consecrated the temple so that his name would be there. His eyes and his heart would be there continually. His eyes would remain open and his ears attentive to prayers offered in that place. This directly answered Solomon's central request. The king had confessed that heaven itself could not contain God, yet he had asked him to watch the house day and night and hear prayers directed toward it. God now promised his attention. He also answered the dangers Solomon had named. If God shut the heavens so that rain did not fall, commanded locusts to consume the land, or sent pestilence among the people, the way back would remain open. If the people called by his name humbled themselves, prayed, sought his face, and turned from their wicked ways, he would hear from heaven. He would forgive their sin and heal their land. The answer preserved the connection Solomon had made between suffering and repentance. Drought, agricultural destruction, and disease would not be relieved by the temple's existence alone. The people had to humble themselves, seek God, and turn from wickedness. The building gave prayer a chosen center. Repentance gave the prayer its truth. God had consecrated the house for his name. His eyes and heart would remain there. That promise made the temple the place Solomon had asked it to become, a center toward which Israel could turn in justice, defeat, famine, sickness, war, and captivity. Then the answer turned from the people to the king. As for you, if you will walk before me as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. The dynasty remained connected to the king's conduct. God had made a covenant with David, promising that David would not lack a man to rule Israel. Solomon now received that promise personally, along with its condition. He had to walk with integrity, obey what God commanded, and keep the statutes and rules placed before him. The temple had been accepted. Solomon's throne had been established. Neither acceptance removed the need for faithfulness. Then the Lord described the opposite path. If Solomon turned aside, or if his descendants turned aside, and they abandoned the commandments and statutes placed before them, the consequences would reach both kingdom and temple. The decisive act would be serving and worshipping other gods. If Solomon and his descendants went after other gods, Israel would be uprooted from the land God had given. The people could be cut off from the land that supported their security and royal greatness. The temple itself would not protect them from that judgment. God would cast the house away from his sight. The building consecrated for his name could become a proverb and a byword among the peoples. The temple was high and magnificent. Its gold, cedar, stone, bronze, courts, and towers displayed the strength of Solomon's kingdom. But if Israel abandoned the Lord, those who passed by would be astonished at its ruin. They would ask, "Why has the Lord done thus to this land and to this house?" The answer would point to broken loyalty. Israel had abandoned the Lord, the God who brought their fathers out of Egypt. They had embraced other gods, worshipped them, and served them. For that reason, the Lord had brought disaster upon them. The same temple could therefore communicate two opposite realities. When Israel sought the Lord, it stood as the consecrated place toward which prayers rose and from which forgiveness could be sought. If Israel abandoned him, its destruction would stand as evidence that sacred architecture had never granted permission to worship other gods. The warning placed responsibility directly before Solomon. He had built a house of extraordinary value, but the future would not be secured by maintaining its cedar, gold, and bronze. The enduring issue was whom the king and his descendants would serve. Solomon had asked God to hear when Israel sinned, repented, and turned back. God promised to hear. But the promise of forgiveness was not a promise that rebellion carried no consequence. Israel could still be defeated, uprooted, and made an object of astonishment. The divine answer therefore confirmed everything glorious in the dedication without allowing Solomon to treat glory as a guarantee detached from obedience. The cloud had filled the house. Fire had consumed the sacrifices. The Lord had placed his name there. His eyes and heart would be attentive to it. And if Solomon turned to other gods, the house could still become a ruin. The king now possessed the clearest possible boundary for his reign. Wisdom, wealth, territory, international honor, and a chosen temple all remained beneath the command to walk faithfully before the Lord. With that word given, the 20-year period of Solomon's two great construction projects came into full view. For 20 years, he had been building the house of the Lord and his own royal house. Hiram of Tyre had supplied him with cedar, cypress, and gold according to Solomon's desire. The partnership had made the buildings possible. Timber from Lebanon covered the temple and filled Solomon's royal halls. Tyrian skill had shaped bronze for the pillars, altar, sea, stands, and basins. Gold had covered the inner sanctuary and adorned the royal city. Solomon had supplied Hiram with food during the work. He now gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. Hiram traveled from Tyre to inspect the cities Solomon had given him. They did not please him. "What kind of cities are these that you have given me, my brother?" Hiram asked. The words exposed a strain inside a relationship that had carried enormous weight. Hiram addressed Solomon as his brother, but he rejected the quality of what he had received. The region came to be called Kabul. Hiram had also sent Solomon 120 talents of gold. That gold belonged to the exchange surrounding Solomon's buildings, just as cedar, cypress, grain, oil, wine, wages, skilled craftsmen, and labor belonged to it. The temple's splendor had been assembled through resources moving between kingdoms. Now territory itself had entered that exchange. The gift of 20 Galilean cities showed the cost of Solomon's desire in a form different from the vast quantities of grain sent to Tyre. Land under Israel's king had been transferred to the foreign ruler who supplied material and gold. Hiram's reaction also showed that even a long, productive alliance could reach a point of dissatisfaction. He had rejoiced when Solomon asked for cedar. He had praised the wisdom God gave David's son. He had sent Huram to work in bronze and had floated timber toward Joppa. After 20 years, he looked upon Solomon's cities and asked what kind of gift his royal brother had given him. The cities did not erase the treaty's achievements. The temple and palace stood complete. Hiram's material remained built into them. His gold had entered Solomon's treasury, but his response prevented the partnership from ending as an uncomplicated exchange of royal generosity. Solomon's greatest building period had now reached its conclusion. The house of the Lord required 7 years. The royal complex required 13. Together, they occupied 20 years of construction. During those years, workers had gone to Lebanon in rotating groups. Foreign residents had carried burdens and cut stone. Supervisors had directed the labor. Hiram's servants had felled timber, brought it to the sea, formed rafts, and sent it toward Joppa. Solomon's kingdom had supplied grain, oil, wine, wages, and manpower. At the end stood two great houses, a consecrated temple and a royal complex. The Lord had answered Solomon's prayer, while Hiram had questioned Solomon's cities. Those two responses measured the completed work in very different ways. God's response defined the temple through covenant. He had heard, chosen, consecrated, and placed his name there. But he warned that disobedience could turn the house into a ruin. Hiram's response exposed the material exchange beneath the splendor. He had supplied what Solomon needed, received cities in Galilee, inspected them, and found them displeasing. The temple's permanence depended on loyalty to God. The royal partnership depended on resources that satisfied both kings. Solomon had reached the completion of everything he desired to build, but completion did not remove conditions. It made them visible. The Lord's condition concerned worship and obedience. Hiram's complaint concerned what Solomon had given in return for years of supply. Both now stood beside the completed buildings. Solomon's wisdom had coordinated nations, workers, materials, and sacred purpose on a scale Israel had never seen under his reign. The next measure of that grandeur would be the system required to maintain it. The labor, cities, officers, ships, tribute, and continuing flow of wealth that kept Solomon's kingdom expanding after the two houses were finished. That system reached across construction sites, fortified cities, military centers, sacred duties, and trade routes. The forced labor Solomon raised had served a defined set of royal projects. The house of the Lord, Solomon's own house, the supporting terraces called the Millo, the wall of Jerusalem, and the fortified cities of Hazor, Megiddo, and Gaza. Each site strengthened a different part of the kingdom. Jerusalem contained the throne, palace, and temple. Hazor and Megiddo were fortified centers. Giza stood on territory with a recent history of Egyptian force and royal exchange. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had attacked Giza and captured it. He burned the city and killed the Canaanites who lived there. Then he gave Giza as a marriage gift to his daughter, Solomon's wife. Solomon rebuilt Giza. The city therefore entered his kingdom through his marriage alliance with Pharaoh and then became part of his building program. Egyptian conquest, royal marriage, and Israelite construction all met in the same place. Solomon also rebuilt Lower Beth Horon and Baalath. He built Tadmor in the wilderness and established store cities in the region of Hamath. He fortified Upper and Lower Beth Horon with walls, gates, and bars. He built additional store cities, chariot cities, and cities for his horsemen. The network spread military resources and royal supplies beyond Jerusalem. Chariots and cavalry already stood at the center of Solomon's strength. Now designated cities housed them, while storage centers held the provisions needed to maintain the kingdom. Solomon constructed whatever he desired in Jerusalem, Lebanon, and throughout the territory under his rule. His activity also extended northward. He went to Hamath Zobah and took it. He then strengthened his presence in that region through Tadmor and the store cities of Hamath. The cities associated with Hiram's transfer also came under Solomon's building work. Solomon rebuilt them and settled Israelites there. Hiram's displeasure had exposed strain in their exchange, but the cities did not remain outside Solomon's administration. Rebuilding and settlement brought them into the network of Israelite population, storage, defense, and royal authority. The reach of the building program was enormous, but it rested on a clear distinction in Solomon's labor system. Several peoples remained in the land: Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They were descendants of the nations Israel had not destroyed. Solomon conscripted their descendants for forced labor. They carried burdens, cut stone, and served the construction system that raised temples, palaces, walls, fortified cities, store centers, and military installations. Solomon did not make slaves from the people of Israel for this labor. Israelites served instead as soldiers, officials, commanders, captains, and leaders over his chariots and horsemen. Hundreds of chief officers exercised authority over the workers and supervised the projects. The distinction placed Israelite men within the military and administrative levels of the kingdom, while the remaining peoples bore the permanent burden of forced service. Yet Solomon had also levied 30,000 Israelites for rotating work in Lebanon during the temple project. That earlier levy sent 10,000 away for 1 month and returned them home for 2. The mature labor system described the enduring forced service class differently. The remaining non-Israelite peoples were conscripted as laborers, while Israelites held military and governing positions. The result was a hierarchy extending from Solomon's throne through chief officers, commanders, supervisors, soldiers, craftsmen, carriers, quarrymen, and foreign workers. That hierarchy could build a city and then support its function. A store city required goods to be gathered and guarded. A chariot city required horses, drivers, officials, barley, straw, and equipment. A fortified city required walls, gates, bars, and commanders. Solomon's kingdom now possessed all of these. The royal building program also changed the household arrangement established at the beginning of his reign. Pharaoh's daughter had first lived in the city of David. After Solomon completed the house built for her, she moved into it. Solomon explained that his wife would not live in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places to which the ark of the Lord had come were holy. The ark had once remained in the city of David beneath the tent David prepared. It now rested inside the temple on Mount Moriah. Solomon treated its former location as set apart by its presence and relocated Pharaoh's daughter to her own royal residence. After she moved, Solomon built the Millo. The transition brought the royal household into the palace complex designed for it. Solomon had built his own residence, a house for Pharaoh's daughter, the Hall of Judgment, the Hall of Pillars, and the House of the Forest of Lebanon. The move placed his Egyptian marriage within those completed royal spaces. At the same time, Solomon maintained the prescribed worship of the temple. 3 times each year, he offered burnt offerings and peace offerings upon the altar he had built before the Lord. These occasions were the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths. He also offered what was required for each day, including offerings for Sabbaths and new moons. Incense was presented before the Lord. The temple was not left as a monument to its dedication. Its altar, courts, lampstands, tables, basins, and priestly spaces were placed into continuing service according to the appointed times. Solomon organized the priests into their divisions for their assigned duties. He arranged the Levites in their divisions to praise and serve alongside the priests according to the requirement of each day. Gatekeepers were assigned in divisions at the various gates. These arrangements followed the command David had given. The priests, Levites, gatekeepers, and those responsible for the treasuries carried out the king's instructions. The same reign that organized provision districts and chariot cities also organized the repeated rhythm of worship. Morning and evening offerings, weekly Sabbaths, monthly new moons, and annual feasts each required designated people, objects, and supplies. Priests needed an ordered division of service. Levites needed their appointed work of praise and assistance. Gatekeepers needed assigned entrances. Treasuries required supervision. The altar needed animals, grain, oil, and fire. The lamps, bread, incense, basins, and utensils each belonged to recurring duties. Solomon's administration connected those sacred needs to the resources of the kingdom. The work of the house was carried from the laying of its foundation through its completion. The building had been finished, and now its ordered service continued. Outside Jerusalem, Solomon's reach moved beyond roads, fortifications, and land-based trade. He went to Etzion-Geber and Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. At Etzion-Geber, Solomon built a fleet of ships. His kingdom had already depended upon sea transport when Hiram floated timber from Lebanon toward Joppa. But that work remained under Tyrian organization until the timber reached the coast. The fleet at Ezion-Geber placed ships directly under Solomon's royal enterprise. Hiram again supplied expertise. He sent servants who knew the sea to work alongside Solomon's servants. The partnership now took a new form. During the temple project, Sidonian woodsmen and Tyrian crews moved cedar down the Mediterranean coast. At Ezion-Geber, experienced seamen joined Solomon's men for a voyage from the Red Sea. They sailed to Ophir. The ships returned carrying more than 400 talents of gold, which they brought to King Solomon. The voyage extended Solomon's acquisition of wealth far beyond tribute from neighboring kingdoms. Gold now reached him through a fleet operating from Edom's coast, with crews drawn from both his servants and Hiram's skilled sailors. This maritime venture depended on the same kind of organized cooperation that had built the temple. Solomon provided the royal project and his servants. Hiram provided men with specialized knowledge. Together they sent ships to a distant source of gold and brought the cargo back to the king. The result joined several edges of Solomon's dominion. In the north, he had taken Hamath-Zobah, rebuilt cities, and established storage centers. In the south, he controlled access to Ezion-Geber and Eloth along the Red Sea. To the west, his marriage alliance connected him with Egypt, while Gaza entered his kingdom as Pharaoh's gift. Within Israel, fortified towns, chariot cities, and cavalry centers connected those outer regions to Jerusalem. At the center stood the temple, palace, offices, and treasuries that received the benefits of this reach. The return from Ophir also intensified the visible fulfillment of what God had promised at Gibeon. Solomon had asked for wisdom and received wealth in addition. Gold had already covered the temple's inner surfaces and filled its treasuries. Hiram had sent 120 talents during the building years. Now ships brought another vast cargo from Ophir. Wisdom and wealth appeared together in the organization required to obtain it. The gold did not arrive through a single local payment. It came after Solomon established a southern port, built ships, secured experienced sailors, and joined them with his own servants. The kingdom's prosperity was therefore supported by layers of service. Foreign descendants labored in construction. Israelites served as soldiers, officers, and commanders. Priests and Levites maintained worship. Gatekeepers guarded assigned entrances. Royal officers supervised cities, workers, and military resources. Hiram's seamen operated beside Solomon's servants. Each group occupied a defined place in the mature kingdom. Solomon's building desires had expanded beyond the temple and palace into a landscape of fortifications, supply centers, and military settlements. His projects reached Jerusalem, Lebanon, Galilee, Hamath, the wilderness, and the Red Sea shore. The walls, gates, and bars of Upper and Lower Beth-horon protected fortified positions. Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer had been rebuilt. Tadmor and Hamath held supplies. Baalath belonged to the system of cities strengthened under Solomon. Chariot and cavalry centers supported the mounted force gathered during his reign. This was royal grandeur as infrastructure. The gold inside Jerusalem depended on ships at Ezion-Geber. The chariots near the king depended on cities built for horses and riders. The palace depended on labor, stone, cedar, and administrative control. The temple's repeated worship depended on divisions of priests, Levites, and gatekeepers. Solomon's wisdom had moved beyond the throne room into a kingdom capable of sustaining all of it at once. Yet the conditions spoken after the temple dedication remained in force throughout that expansion. The Lord had promised to hear repentant prayer and keep his attention upon the house. Solomon continued the prescribed offerings and divisions of service. The Lord had also warned the king not to turn toward other gods. Solomon's marriage to Pharaoh's daughter remained part of his royal system, and he had carefully moved her from the holy place associated with the ark into the house built for her. For now, the kingdom displayed order. Worship followed its appointed calendar. Officers held authority. Cities were fortified. Ships returned with gold. The strength of the reign could be measured through distances, from Hamath in the north to Etzion-Geber in the south, from the territories east of the Jordan to the border of Egypt. It could be measured through buildings, temple, palace, walls, store cities, chariot cities, and fortified gates. It could be measured through service, workers, officers, soldiers, priests, Levites, gatekeepers, sailors, and merchants, and it could be measured through gold arriving from beyond the sea. Reports of Solomon's wisdom had already traveled among the nations. Now any foreign ruler hearing them also heard of a kingdom whose order could be seen in worship, military power, construction, and trade. The question was no longer whether Solomon possessed wisdom. It was whether the reality in Jerusalem could equal everything being said about him abroad. One foreign ruler came to test it. The Queen of Sheba had heard of Solomon's fame in connection with the name of the Lord. Reports had reached her country describing a king whose wisdom was joined to extraordinary prosperity and worship centered in Jerusalem. She did not accept those reports without examination. She came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with difficult questions. The queen arrived with a very great retinue. Camels carried spices, large quantities of gold, and precious stones. Her arrival displayed wealth before she ever entered Solomon's presence, but the purpose of her journey centered on what the king knew. When she came before Solomon, she spoke with him about everything on her mind. The content of her questions remained between the two rulers. What mattered publicly was their difficulty and Solomon's response. He answered every question she brought. Nothing was hidden from him that he could not explain to her. The exchange gave the queen the test she had traveled to conduct. She did not rely on a report carried by someone else. She placed the difficult questions before Solomon herself and heard his answers directly. But Solomon's words were only one part of what she came to recognize. She saw the wisdom with which he spoke, and she saw the house he had built. She saw the food served at his table, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants, their clothing, and his cupbearers. She also saw his ascent to the house of the Lord and the burnt offerings he presented there. Each part revealed a different expression of royal order. The house showed what Solomon's builders and craftsmen had completed for the monarchy. The table showed the abundance supplied through his districts. The placement of his officials showed an administration in which people held defined rank and responsibility. The servants standing in attendance and the clothing they wore displayed the organization of the royal household. The cupbearers belonged to the service surrounding the king. The ascent toward the temple joined Solomon's court to the worship of the Lord. The queen had arrived prepared to question one man. What she encountered was a kingdom arranged around his wisdom. The food at Solomon's table did not appear by accident. 12 district officers supplied the royal household month by month. Grain, cattle, sheep, game, and birds arrived according to their appointed responsibility. Barley and straw supported the horses. Store cities held supplies. Officials connected distant regions to Jerusalem. The queen did not need an explanation of every administrative line to see its result. The table was set. The servants stood in their places. The officials occupied their seats. The royal household functioned before her. The same was true of the temple ascent. Solomon had spent years gathering timber, stone, gold, bronze, craftsmen, and laborers. Priests and Levites now served in their divisions. Offerings were presented according to the appointed days and feasts. The queen saw the completed order where others had only heard reports. When she took in Solomon's wisdom and everything arranged around him, there was no more breath in her. She then addressed the king. The report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom. Before coming, she had not believed the reports. She waited until she arrived and saw with her own eyes. Now she understood that the reports had understated what was in Jerusalem. Behold, the half was not told me. Solomon's wisdom and prosperity exceeded what she had heard. Her response carried unusual weight because she had arrived as a ruler conducting a test. She had brought difficult questions, spoken everything on her mind, and examined the royal order before her. Her praise followed direct examination. The queen then looked at the people surrounding Solomon. Happy are your men. Happy are these your servants, who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Solomon's wisdom benefited more than the foreign visitor who had traveled to question him. His servants heard him continually. The people working closest to the throne lived within daily reach of the discernment that had drawn a queen from another land. Then she blessed the Lord. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. The queen connected Solomon's kingship to God's pleasure and God's love for Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, that you may execute justice and righteousness. Her words identified the responsibility attached to everything she admired. Wisdom, wealth, officials, servants, and magnificent buildings did not define the king's purpose by themselves. Solomon had been placed on the throne to maintain justice and righteousness. That was the same task for which he had asked wisdom at Gibeon. He had requested an understanding heart because he believed governing God's people was too great for him without divine help. The Queen of Sheba now recognized the answer and named its intended result. Her blessing also carried the fame of Israel's God beyond Israel. She had heard of Solomon in connection with the Lord's name. After questioning him and seeing Jerusalem, she spoke praise to the God who had placed him on the throne. The temple contributed to that recognition. Solomon's ascent and offerings did not stand apart from the royal order she admired. They showed the relationship between the king and the God whose name had become associated with his wisdom. Yet the queen's words also gave Solomon a measure by which his future conduct could be judged. The Lord's love for Israel had placed him on the throne to execute justice and righteousness. Royal splendor served that purpose. It did not replace it. After speaking, the queen presented her gifts. She gave Solomon 120 talents of gold. She also gave him a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. The abundance of spices she brought was unmatched. Nothing equal to the quantity given by the Queen of Sheba came again. Spices, gold, and precious stones had traveled with her camels into Jerusalem. They now entered the wealth of the king, whose answers and royal order had surpassed what she expected. The gifts expressed more than the expense of a royal visit. They followed recognition. The queen had tested Solomon, accepted his wisdom as greater than the reports, blessed his God, and then placed extraordinary wealth before him. Her 120 talents of gold matched the scale of the gold Hiram had sent during Solomon's building partnership. But the queen's gift came from a different relationship. Hiram's gold belonged to years of supply, treaty, and construction. Her gold followed a personal encounter in which a foreign ruler had examined Solomon and praised what she found. The spices added another form of rarity to the exchange. Gold could be weighed, precious stones could be stored. The quantity of spices remained memorable because nothing comparable arrived afterward. Separate from what the queen brought, Hiram's fleet also returned from Ophir with gold, algum wood, and precious stones. Solomon used the algum wood to make supports for the house of the Lord and the king's house. He also made lyres and harps for the singers. Wood of that kind had not been seen in such use before. The imported timber therefore entered both architecture and music. Some strengthened the temple and palace. Some became instruments used by singers. This additional material did not belong to the queen's caravan, but it displayed the larger world of exchange surrounding her visit. Ships brought gold, rare wood, and stones from Ophir. Camels brought gold, spices, and stones from Sheba. Jerusalem received wealth by both sea and land. Solomon responded to the queen's generosity from his own royal abundance. He gave her everything she desired and requested, in addition to what he gave from his royal bounty. The exchange was therefore not one-sided. The queen placed extraordinary gifts before Solomon, and Solomon sent her away with what she asked and what he chose to give. Then she turned and returned to her own land with her servants. She departed with more than the answers to difficult questions. She had seen the house, table, officials, servants, cupbearers, clothing, temple ascent and offerings. She had judged the reports by her own eyes and declared that they had told her less than half. Her servants had accompanied her through the same royal spaces. They returned with her after Solomon supplied the queen's requests. The visit placed Solomon at the summit of international recognition. Earlier, people had come from surrounding nations to hear his wisdom. Now, a queen had arrived with a great retinue, tested him personally, and publicly blessed the Lord for placing him on Israel's throne. Her testimony joined wisdom and prosperity without separating them from justice. She did not merely call Solomon clever or wealthy. She identified his throne as an expression of God's love for Israel and his royal duty as the execution of justice and righteousness. That made her admiration both praise and responsibility. The same king who answered every question had to keep the covenant condition already spoken to him. The same throne admired by a foreign queen had to remain governed by integrity. The same house whose ascent overwhelmed her could become a ruin if Solomon or his descendants worshipped other gods. Those consequences had not yet overtaken the visible glory. The queen saw order, abundance, and wisdom. Her words contained no report of instability within the kingdom she inspected. The court functioned with precision. The temple stood in sacred service. The king answered what she asked. Solomon's servants heard his wisdom continually. Her declaration that the half had not been told became the strongest confirmation yet of Solomon's reputation. What had traveled abroad as fame returned to Jerusalem as the testimony of a foreign ruler. The journey also revealed the reach of that reputation. She had heard of Solomon in her own land. His connection to the Lord's name had traveled with the reports. His wisdom drew her across distance, and the reality she saw caused her to praise Israel's God. The visit therefore extended Solomon's influence without military conquest. He did not summon the queen as a subject bringing tribute. She came to test him. She spoke all that was on her mind. She made her judgment after hearing his answers and seeing his kingdom. Her gifts followed that independent recognition. Solomon's own generosity then completed the exchange. He answered her questions with wisdom and her gifts with royal bounty. By the time she departed, the king's fame had passed through every stage of examination available in the visit. The report had reached her. She had doubted it. She had traveled to Jerusalem. She had tested Solomon. She had seen his royal order. She had blessed his God. She had declared that the reality exceeded the report. Now, she carried her own knowledge back to her land. Behind her remained the material signs she had praised: the palace, temple, table, servants, officers, and offerings. Gold from Sheba entered a kingdom already receiving gold from Ophir, Hiram, merchants, and subject rulers. Precious stones and rare wood entered buildings already covered with costly material. Spices arrived in a quantity never repeated. The Queen of Sheba had measured Solomon from the perspective of another throne and found him greater than she had been told. After her departure, the full material scale of that greatness still remained to be measured. The gold that came to Solomon in a single year weighed 666 talents. That figure did not include the revenue from merchants and traders, the tribute from the kings of Arabia, or the payments brought by the governors of the land. Gold entered Jerusalem through several channels at once. Ships returned from Ophir, foreign rulers arrived with gifts, merchants conducted trade, Subject kings and regional governors brought revenue. The annual total stood beside all of these additional streams. Solomon used part of the gold to create objects of royal display. He made 200 large shields from hammered gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. He also made 300 smaller shields from hammered gold, using 3 minas for each one. Solomon placed the shields in the house of the forest of Lebanon. The cedar hall already displayed the scale of his royal architecture. Now 500 golden shields stood within it. Gold had moved from tribute and trade into objects associated with the king's house. Solomon also made a great throne. Its central material was ivory, and he overlaid it with the finest gold. 6 steps led upward to the seat. A golden footstool was attached to it. The back of the throne was rounded at the top, and armrests stood on either side of the seat. 2 lions stood beside the armrests. 12 more lions stood upon the steps, one at either end of each step. The design placed Solomon above a rising line of golden lions. Anyone approaching the throne ascended visually through the symbols arranged below the king and beside his hands. Nothing like that throne had been made for any other kingdom. The throne turned royal judgment into a public image. Solomon had once judged the dispute between 2 women without any elaborate description of the place where he sat. Now his authority was physically framed by ivory, gold, steps, armrests, and lions. The throne did not give him wisdom. God had placed wisdom in his heart, but the throne made the material power surrounding that wisdom impossible to miss. The same was true of Solomon's drinking vessels. Every vessel from which he drank was made of gold. All the vessels in the house of the forest of Lebanon were made of pure gold. Silver was not used for these objects because silver was considered of little value during Solomon's days. He made it as common in Jerusalem as stones. The comparison revealed how far the kingdom had moved from ordinary measures of wealth. Silver remained a precious metal, but in Solomon's Jerusalem, it no longer marked the highest level of royal value. Gold had taken that place across vessels, shields, walls, floors, furnishings, and throne. Cedar underwent a similar transformation of scale. Solomon made cedar as abundant as the sycamore trees of the lowland. The timber, once requiring a special treaty with Hiram, now appeared throughout temple and palace construction. Cedar covered walls, supported roofs, formed pillars, and gave the house of the forest of Lebanon its name. Solomon's ships expanded the flow of rare goods. A fleet of Tarshish sailed with Hiram's fleet. Once every 3 years, the ships returned, carrying gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. The cargo joined wealth with rarity. Gold and silver increased the royal treasury. Ivory entered works like Solomon's throne. Animals and birds from distant lands entered the visible abundance of his court. The 3-year cycle required sustained maritime organization. The ships had to remain in service across a long interval before returning with their cargo. Hiram's experienced sailors continued to connect Tyrian knowledge with Solomon's royal enterprise. The fleet operating with Hiram's men complemented the ships Solomon had built at Etzion-Geber. One route had already brought gold from Ophir. The fleet of Tarshish now returned periodically with a wider collection of valuable and exotic goods. Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. Those 2 forms of greatness drew people toward him for different but connected reasons. His riches made Jerusalem a center of visible royal splendor. His wisdom made his presence worth seeking. The whole earth sought an audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put into his heart. Visitors did not come empty-handed. Each brought a gift: articles of silver and gold, garments, spices, horses, and mules. This happened year after year. The Queen of Sheba had arrived with one exceptional caravan and a personal test. The continuing stream of visitors showed that her journey was part of a wider international movement towards Solomon. kings and their representatives heard of his wisdom and came to listen. The gifts they brought then increased the wealth that made his court even more extraordinary to the next visitor. Wisdom produced fame. Fame drew rulers. Rulers brought gifts. Those gifts enlarged the visible glory surrounding the king whose wisdom they had come to hear. The process repeated annually. Solomon's answers therefore carried material consequences far beyond the moment of conversation. The wisdom God gave him became one of the forces drawing gold, silver, garments, spices, horses, and mules into Jerusalem. Yet the wisdom remained identified as God's gift. The nations sought Solomon's presence because of what God had placed in his heart. His fame did not erase that origin. The king was extraordinary because he had received what he could not create for himself at Gibeon. Solomon also continued gathering military resources. He accumulated 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. He stationed them in chariot cities and with himself in Jerusalem. The mounted force connected the capital to fortified military centers. Horses and chariots stood ready under officers and commanders assigned to them. Solomon imported horses from Egypt and Quay. His traders purchased them from Quay at the established price. A chariot imported from Egypt cost 600 shekels of silver. A horse cost 150. Through Solomon's traders, those chariots and horses were also supplied to the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Aram. The king therefore controlled more than his own collection. His merchants participated in a trade that carried military equipment from Egypt toward other regional rulers. Silver flowed outward to purchase horses and chariots. The animals and vehicles moved through Solomon's trading network. Some entered his own chariot cities and Jerusalem. Others were exported to foreign kings. The operation required merchants who could negotiate purchases, transport the animals and vehicles, and deliver them across borders. Solomon's administration had become a link between Egypt, Quay, Israel, the Hittite kings, and Aram. His dominion extended over the kings from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines and the border of Egypt. That territorial reach supported his commercial position. Solomon sat between regions producing horses and chariots and kingdoms willing to buy them. His traders turned geography into royal advantage. The chariot forces also gave physical form to his dominion. 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen were not concentrated in one location. Some remained with Solomon in Jerusalem, while others were distributed among cities designed to house them. The store cities supported this structure. Fodder had to reach the horses. Equipment had to be maintained. Officers had to command the riders. Roads and fortified centers connected the mounted force across the kingdom. The same rain that made silver common as stone spent silver in large quantities on military imports. The same king who received horses as annual gifts purchased additional horses through Egypt and Quay. The same international relationships that carried wisdom and tribute into Jerusalem also carried chariots and horses through Solomon's merchants. Acquisition had become continuous. Gold arrived every year. The fleet returned every 3 years. Foreign visitors brought gifts year by year. Merchants added their revenue. Regional rulers supplied tribute. Horses and chariots entered through established prices and trade routes. Silver, gold, ivory, spices, garments, animals, and rare wood accumulated around the throne. Solomon transformed some of that wealth into permanent symbols. Gold became shields. Ivory and gold became the throne. Pure gold became drinking vessels. Rare wood became structural supports and musical instruments. Other wealth remained in circulation. Silver purchased horses. Ships sailed again. Merchants continued trading. Governors continued bringing revenue. The royal economy therefore held both treasure and movement. The gold shields stayed in the house of the Forest of Lebanon, while ships and traders went out to bring more. The throne presented the clearest single image of Solomon's apex. 6 steps raised the seat above the floor. 12 lions lined the ascent. 2 more stood beside the armrests. Ivory formed the throne, and refined gold covered it. It was a place designed for one man. The officials had their seats, the servants their stations, and the cupbearers their duties. But the throne gathered the entire hierarchy toward Solomon. Foreign visitors came into that arrangement to hear him. They saw the gold, climbed into the presence of the king, presented their gifts, and listened to the wisdom placed in his heart. The Queen of Sheba had declared Solomon's servants happy because they stood continually before him and heard his wisdom. The annual visitors experienced only a portion of what those servants heard. Yet they valued even that portion enough to cross borders with silver, gold, garments, spices, horses, and mules. Solomon's wisdom had become an international destination. His wealth had become evidence of the reach attached to it. His court had become the place where the two met. This was the public height of the reign. Israel lived under a king whose dominion reached from the Euphrates toward Egypt. Foreign kings sought his presence. Fleets returned with rare cargo. Gold covered royal objects. Chariots filled designated cities. Merchants supplied rulers beyond Israel. The temple stood complete and active. The palace complex displayed cedar and precious metal. The throne had no equal among kingdoms. The annual 666 talents of gold measured only one part of the inflow. The additional revenue from merchants, traders, Arabian kings, and governors widened the scale beyond that number. Solomon did not merely inherit David's kingdom. He turned it into the center of a network of tribute, trade, wisdom, worship, military power, and architectural magnificence. But the covenant conditions spoken to him had never been based on the size of that network. God had not told Solomon that the throne would endure if enough gold entered Jerusalem. He had not connected the dynasty to the number of chariots, the reach of trade, or the admiration of other kings. He had told Solomon to walk with integrity, keep his commands, and remain faithful. That distinction now mattered more than ever because material success could answer almost every visible demand placed before the king. If Solomon wanted cedar, Hiram supplied it. If he wanted stone, quarrymen cut it. If he wanted gold, ships, merchants, rulers, and governors brought it. If he wanted chariots and horses, his traders purchased them from Egypt and Quay. If he wanted fortified cities, laborers built them. If he wanted a throne unlike any other, ivory and gold were shaped around him. The kingdom had become extraordinarily effective at fulfilling Solomon's desires. Its officers could organize them. Its workers could build them. Its merchants could import them. Its wealth could pay for them. Its ships could travel for them. The danger named by the Lord involved something that none of those systems could secure: the direction of the king's heart. Solomon's public life displayed wisdom, order, worship, justice, power, and abundance. Foreign rulers saw those things and blessed the God who had placed him on the throne. But covenant loyalty was not measured by what foreign visitors could see in his halls. It was measured by whether Solomon continued to serve the Lord without turning toward other gods. The king had reached a point at which almost every relationship surrounding him increased his strength. Hiram brought timber, craftsmen, sailors, and gold. Pharaoh's house brought marriage alliance and Giza. Foreign kings brought tribute, merchants brought revenue, visitors brought gifts. The rulers of distant lands sought his wisdom. Those relationships had helped create Solomon's glory. They had also drawn his court outward into a world of foreign thrones, royal exchanges, imported wealth, and political bonds. The gold, vessels, horses, and chariots showed what those bonds produced in public. What remained unseen in the spectacle was what the king himself would serve. Solomon had once described himself as a little child who did not know how to go out or come in. He had asked for discernment because governing Israel required more than royal authority. God had given him wisdom beyond every other king. Now Solomon possessed wealth beyond every other king as well. The conditions surrounding him had changed completely since Gibeon. He no longer stood at the beginning of his reign, confessing what he lacked. Nations came to him because of what he possessed. The central requirement, however, had not changed. His heart had to remain wholly true to the Lord. At the summit of Solomon's visible greatness, that private allegiance became the one measure gold could not display. Solomon loved many foreign women. Pharaoh's daughter was among them, along with Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women. These women came from nations about which the Lord had given Israel a direct command. The Israelites were not to enter into marriage with them, and they were not to enter into marriage with Israel. The reason had also been stated. They will surely turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon held fast to these women in love. His marriages expanded far beyond the alliance he had formed with Pharaoh. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. The numbers displayed another kind of royal accumulation. Solomon had gathered gold, chariots, horses, ships, buildings, officials, and international relationships. His household now contained 1,000 women bound to him as wives and concubines, including hundreds of royal daughters. The command had warned that those relationships would turn the heart. As Solomon grew old, his wives did exactly that. They turned his heart after other gods. His heart was no longer wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. This was the failure the gold could not display. Solomon had continued offering sacrifices at the temple. He had arranged priests and Levites according to their divisions. He had built the house for the name of the Lord and placed the ark beneath the wings of the cherubim. But covenant loyalty required more than maintaining the temple's public service. Solomon's heart itself had to remain wholly devoted to the Lord. Instead, he went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord fully, as David had done. The turn in his heart became visible in stone and worship. On the mountain east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab. He also built one for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The king who had built the temple now built high places for other gods within sight of Jerusalem. The contrast did not depend on a private suspicion about Solomon's intentions. His actions had become public structures. He ordered places of worship built. His wives offered incense and sacrifices there. Solomon himself went after foreign gods. The temple remained on Mount Moriah, but it no longer represented the undivided allegiance of the king who built it. Solomon had once stood before Israel and asked that the people's hearts be wholly true to the Lord. He had repeated the command to walk in God's statutes and keep his commandments. Now his own heart had turned. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel. This was not a warning Solomon had never heard. God had appeared to him twice. At Gibeon, Solomon had received wisdom, riches, and honor. He had also received a condition. If he walked in God's ways and kept his statutes, his days would be lengthened. After the temple dedication, the Lord had answered Solomon's prayer and placed his name upon the house. He had again told Solomon to walk with integrity and keep his commandments. The warning had specifically named the danger now taking place. If Solomon or his descendants turned aside and served other gods, Israel could be uprooted and the temple cast away. God had commanded Solomon not to go after other gods. Solomon did not keep that command. The Lord therefore spoke judgment against him. Since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant." The sentence attacked the greatest visible achievement of Solomon's reign. He had secured David's throne against Adonijah. He had removed Joab and Abiathar from power. He had organized Israel through officials, districts, military centers, store cities, labor forces, and trade routes. He had ruled other kingdoms from the Euphrates toward Egypt. Now God declared that the kingdom would be torn away and given to one of Solomon's own servants. Yet the judgment contained a delay because of David. The kingdom would not be torn away during Solomon's lifetime. God would tear it from the hand of Solomon's son. Even then, the entire kingdom would not be taken. One tribe would remain for the sake of David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city God had chosen. Solomon's throne would therefore survive, but in a reduced form. David's line and the chosen city would be preserved while most of the kingdom passed to another ruler. The sentence matched the covenant boundary already given. God had promised David an enduring line, but he had not promised Solomon that disobedience would leave the United Kingdom untouched. The delay also made the consequence a legacy. Solomon would retain the throne through his own lifetime, while his son would inherit the tearing produced by his father's conduct. The king, who had received a strong and peaceful kingdom, would leave his successor a kingdom under judgment. That judgment did not immediately remove the gold from Solomon's halls or the chariots from his cities. Foreign rulers could continue to seek his wisdom. His servants could continue standing in royal order. But the future of the kingdom had changed. Its apparent unity now had a divine limit placed upon it. The Lord also raised adversaries against Solomon. Their histories had begun before the announcement of the kingdom's division, and one of them opposed Solomon throughout his reign. Their presence revealed that the peace surrounding the throne was not as complete as the royal court appeared. The first was Hadad the Edomite. Hadad belonged to the royal house of Edom. His hostility reached back into David's reign when David's forces operated in Edom. Joab, the commander of the army, went there to bury the slain and struck down every male in Edom. Joab and all Israel remained there for 6 months while he carried out that destruction. Hadad was a young child at the time. He escaped with Edomite servants who had served his father. They traveled toward Egypt. Leaving Edom, they passed through Midian and came to Paran. Men from Paran joined them, and the group continued into Egypt. Hadad entered Pharaoh's presence. Pharaoh gave him a house, assigned him food, and granted him land. The Edomite child who had fled from Joab's campaign therefore grew within the protection of Egypt's king. Hadad found great favor in Pharaoh's sight. Pharaoh gave him in marriage the sister of his own wife, Queen Tahpenes. She gave birth to Hadad's son, Genubath. Tahpenes weaned Genubath inside Pharaoh's house, and the boy lived among Pharaoh's sons. Hadad's life had moved from the threatened royal house of Edom into the royal household of Egypt. He had land, food, a house, and a marriage connection to Pharaoh. Then news reached him that David had died and that Joab, commander of the army, was dead. Hadad went to Pharaoh. "Let me depart," he said, "that I may go to my own country." Pharaoh asked what Hadad lacked while living with him. Why did he suddenly seek to return home? Hadad answered, "Nothing, but let me depart anyway." His request did not accuse Pharaoh of withholding anything. Hadad acknowledged no lack in Egypt. He still asked to return to Edom. The Edomite royal survivor now stood as an adversary raised against Solomon. The alliance with Pharaoh had brought Solomon a royal wife and the city of Gaza. But Pharaoh's house had also sheltered Hadad, supplied him, joined him by marriage to the queen's sister, and raised his son among Pharaoh's sons. The same foreign court connected to Solomon through marriage had protected a man whose history was rooted in violence inflicted by David's commander. Solomon's wealth and alliances could not undo that history. Hadad had survived Joab's campaign as a child. He had entered Egypt with his father's servants, grown in Pharaoh's favor, and asked to return after David and Joab were dead. The adversary did not arise because Solomon lacked military power. Solomon possessed chariots, horsemen, fortified cities, and dominion across surrounding kingdoms. Hadad arose from a royal line Joab had tried to destroy. A second adversary came from another conflict linked to David's reign. His name was Rezon, the son of Eliada. Rezon had fled from his master Hadadezer, king of Zobah. After David struck down the forces associated with Hadadezer, Rezon gathered men around himself and became leader of a raiding band. He and his men went to Damascus. They settled there and made Rezon king. Rezon ruled in Aram and became an adversary to Israel throughout Solomon's days. He hated Israel and caused trouble alongside the harm done by Hadad. Rezon's rise gave hostile power a political center. He was not merely a fugitive moving beyond Solomon's reach. He gathered followers, occupied Damascus, and ruled from there as king. Solomon's dominion had extended toward the Euphrates, and his merchants had supplied chariots and horses to the kings of Aram. Now an enemy ruled in Damascus and opposed Israel. Hadad and Rezon came from different places and different histories. Hadad belonged to Edom's royal house and escaped as a child into Egypt. Rezon had served Hadadezer of Zobah, fled from him, gathered a band, and became king in Damascus. Hadad's life was preserved through Pharaoh's household. Rezon built power through armed followers. Both stood outside Solomon's direct control. Their existence fractured the image of uninterrupted peace surrounding his reign. Solomon had once told Hiram that the Lord had given him rest on every side, with neither adversary nor misfortune. That rest had opened the way for the temple. Now adversaries pressed from Edom and Aram. The change did not erase the years of peace that had made Solomon's building possible. It showed that the conditions around the kingdom had shifted. The Lord's anger against Solomon placed Hadad and Rezon within the consequences surrounding his reign. Yet their own histories remained concrete. They were not unexplained threats appearing from empty territory. David's wars and Joab's violence had left survivors and enemies. Hadad carried Edom's royal claim. Rezon carried the aftermath of conflict with Zobah. Solomon inherited both. His wisdom could answer difficult questions, but it could not make Hadad's childhood disappear. His gold could purchase horses and chariots, but it could not erase Rezon's rule in Damascus. His Egyptian marriage gave him a powerful alliance, but Egypt had also given Hadad protection. His northern dominion brought tribute, but Aram now contained a king who hated Israel. The international network that had displayed Solomon's strength also contained relationships and memories that resisted him. External pressure was now joined to internal judgment. Hadad threatened from the world connected to Edom and Egypt. Rezon threatened from Damascus, and God had declared that most of the kingdom would pass to one of Solomon's servants. The external adversaries already had names, histories, and centers of opposition. The servant had not yet been named. That unnamed figure would not come from a distant royal house or a foreign band. He would rise from inside the machinery Solomon himself had built. Jeroboam was the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zeradah. His mother Zeruiah was a widow. He served Solomon. Jeroboam was a capable young man and an industrious worker. Solomon saw the quality of his work and placed him over the entire labor force of the house of Joseph. The appointment brought him into the administration that sustained Solomon's building program. The king had raised the Millo and closed the breach in the city of David. Jeroboam now held authority over workers connected with those projects. He did not begin as a foreign invader or the heir of a rival dynasty. He rose because Solomon recognized his ability and gave him responsibility. Then Jeroboam lifted his hand against the king. During that period, he left Jerusalem and traveled along a road outside the city. Ahijah, a prophet from Shiloh, met him there. Ahijah was wearing a new garment. The two men were alone in the open country. The prophet took hold of the new garment and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he told Jeroboam to take 10 pieces for himself. The garment had been whole when Ahijah approached. It was now divided on the ground between them, and most of its pieces were placed within Jeroboam's reach. The prophet gave the meaning. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes. The servant named in the judgment against Solomon now stood before the prophet. He was not a prince, foreign king, or commander approaching with an army. He was an Ephraimite official whom Solomon himself had promoted over royal labor. Jeroboam's new authority would not come from the position Solomon had already given him. That position placed him over workers. The promise delivered by Ahijah placed him over tribes, but the division would not be total. One tribe will remain his. The preserved portion belonged to David's house for 2 stated reasons: David, whom the Lord had chosen, and Jerusalem, the city chosen from all the tribes of Israel. The torn garment therefore represented judgment with a boundary. 10 pieces went to Jeroboam. 1 tribe remained attached to Solomon's son. David's line would retain a lamp in Jerusalem. Ahijah then explained why the kingdom would be divided. "They have forsaken me." The foreign gods Solomon had followed were named again: Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians; Chemosh, the god of Moab; and Milcom, the god of the Ammonites. Solomon had not walked in the Lord's ways. He had not done what was right by keeping the statutes and rules placed before him. The division was therefore tied directly to worship. The kingdom was not being torn because Solomon lacked administrative skill or because Jeroboam had surpassed him in wisdom. It was being torn because the king had abandoned undivided loyalty to the Lord. Ahijah also explained why Solomon would continue ruling during his own lifetime. The Lord would not take the entire kingdom from Solomon's hand. Solomon would remain ruler throughout his days for the sake of David, whom the Lord had chosen and who had kept his commandments and statutes. The tearing would occur through Solomon's son. "I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand and will give it to you, 10 tribes." The delay did not cancel the sentence. It determined who would bear its public arrival. Solomon would die as king over the united realm. His son would receive the throne and then lose most of what came with it. Jeroboam would receive those tribes. The one remaining tribe would preserve a lamp for David before the Lord in Jerusalem, the city chosen as the place for his name. The promise to David survived inside the judgment against Solomon. Jerusalem would remain connected to David's house, while most of Israel passed into another man's hand. Ahijah then spoke directly about Jeroboam's future. "I will take you, and you shall reign over all that your soul desires, and you shall be king over Israel." The man standing alone with a torn garment was being offered a kingdom. The 10 pieces did not yet give him an army, palace, throne, or city. They gave him a divine promise that the kingdom Solomon had organized would be divided and that Jeroboam would rule most of it. That promise also came with a condition: "If you will listen to all that I command you, and will walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you." Jeroboam's elevation would not free him from the obedience required of Solomon. Receiving 10 tribes did not give him permission to choose his own gods or set aside divine commands. He had to listen, walk in the Lord's ways, do what was right, and keep the statutes and commandments. If he did, the Lord would build him an enduring house as he had built one for David. "I will give Israel to you." The promise extended beyond Jeroboam's personal rule. An enduring house meant a continuing dynasty. The servant could receive not only 10 tribes, but a royal line over them. Yet the condition came before the dynasty. Jeroboam's future house depended on the same kind of loyalty Solomon had abandoned. The division would afflict David's descendants, but not forever. Ahijah did not tell Jeroboam that David's line had been rejected completely. One tribe, one city, and one lamp remained. The judgment reduced David's kingdom without extinguishing David's house. The torn garment held all of these distinctions at once. Solomon's united kingdom would be divided. 10 tribes would go to Jeroboam. A portion would remain with Solomon's son. Jerusalem would remain the chosen city. David's lamp would continue. Jeroboam could receive an enduring house if he obeyed. David's descendants would be afflicted, but not forever. Ahijah had not merely announced that political unrest was coming, he had identified the future ruler, the size of his portion, the reason for the division, the timing of the transfer, the condition of his dynasty, and the limit placed upon David's humiliation. Jeroboam now carried knowledge Solomon's other servants did not possess. He knew that most of Israel had been promised to him. He knew the transfer would come from Solomon's son rather than from Solomon during his lifetime. He also knew that the Lord's standard would not change when the crown changed hands. The encounter ended with the new garment lying in 12 torn pieces and 10 assigned to Solomon's servant. Solomon then sought to kill Jeroboam. The king who had promoted him now treated him as a threat to the throne. Jeroboam fled from Solomon and went to Egypt. He found refuge with Shishak, king of Egypt. He remained in Egypt while Solomon continued to reign. The flight prevented Solomon from carrying out the death he sought. Jeroboam was beyond his immediate reach, and the man designated to receive 10 tribes remained alive. Solomon still sat upon the throne in Jerusalem. His officials continued serving. His fortified cities, chariots, fleets, palace, and temple remained under his authority. But one of his own servants now lived under the protection of Egypt's king with a promise concerning Israel's future. Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. Then Solomon died. He was buried in the city of David, his father. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, reigned in his place. The city now held Solomon's burial place, while Rehoboam possessed the throne already standing beneath the sentence of division.